Hey. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Should I say it again? So, it's been 6 months to the day, Mr. Secretary, since you last appeared here, and I certainly welcome you back. We all do. And at that October 12th hearing, we talked about your efforts to refocus the department's limited budget resources to address what you see as the most pressing challenges. You outlined a number of priorities, which included promoting the nation's energy security, strengthening the nation's national security and nuclear deterrent, spurring innovation, and, yes, cleaning up the legacy Cold War sites. The proposed $30.6 billion budget that we're discussing today reflects those priorities. There's a $15 billion for the National Nuclear Security Administration, which would continue critical spending for DOE's defense and national security programs at a level some $2 billion higher than the previous administration's spending. The budget maintains about $5.5 billion for the Office of Science and its fundamental and basic research programs, which is the seedbed for innovation. That's up somewhat from the previous administration's spending, and there is $6.6 billion for the Office of Environmental Management, the highest level in some 15 years. Concerning the various energy programs, the budget provides $2.5 billion, which represents a substantial cut overall from the previous spending across these programs. And I would encourage you to continue working with the committee to identify additional authorities that you need to be more effective, and I know that you'll do that. We also need to recognize that as our energy systems, market mechanisms, and federal and state environmental policies become more entangled, existing and emerging hazards to energy systems may have far more reaching consequences than we may be accustomed to. For example, a successful cyber attack on certain business systems would certainly undermine confidence in energy trading systems, even if it doesn't pose a threat to physical operations. A major cold event like January's bomb cyclone can lead to severe shortages in power or energy when people need it most, or, as testimony at our second modernization hearing this year noted, factors that lead to the decline in our nation's nuclear infrastructure can undermine long-term national security and international leadership on non-proliferation and safety. So these energy policy and energy securities present serious challenges, no question. Challenges that transcend our current market setup. It is essential for you, as Secretary of the Energy, to survey energy and national security risks, to identify the implications of our existing energy policy and energy infrastructure, recommend appropriate action, and help us make more informed policy decisions. Your budget should provide the resources for you to do that work, and your leadership should focus on tackling those large and consequential questions. I look forward to this morning's discussions and would yield for an opening statement to the ranking member of the Energy Subcommittee, Mr. Rush from Illinois.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to welcome you, Mr. Secretary. And Mr. Secretary, I really like how you entered into the room. You came over and shook hands with the outside of the aisle here, and your personal touch means a lot. And in this era of extremism, most that really the human touch that you exhibited means a lot to me, and I want to thank you for it. Mr. Secretary, I look forward to working with your office to ensure that the department moves the nation's energy policies forward in a way that benefits all Americans and indeed benefits all communities. History has shown all of us the importance of having people with different perspectives and different life experiences at the proverbial table when important and consequential decisions are initially being considered. So when I talk about having diversity in leadership positions at DOE, it's just not for the sake of having diversity, but rather it helps to ensure that specific groups or communities aren't being excluded, whether it's intentional or not. Whether decisions are being made regarding which universities are awarded research grants or which businesses can receive contracts, or even how a specific policy might impact a particular community. Having a sense of diversity, having real diversity in demographics and in opinion helps to make sure certain groups aren't being left out. So, Mr. Secretary, I look forward to meeting with you soon to discuss your thoughts on this very issue and to see how we might be able to work together to make sure that the department is providing aid and resources to all communities in a way that's sustainable, regardless of the administration that's in office. Mr. Secretary, besides the objective of making sure the department enacts inclusive policies, also have strong views in regards to the FY19 budget proposal that was put forth by the administration. Specifically, this budget proposal will cut the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy by 70% from FY 2018 levels, with over $600 million of these reductions coming from energy efficiency programs. These proposed cuts are non-starter as far as I'm concerned. They would severely and negatively impact low-income families throughout my home state of Illinois and the nation by eliminating extremely popular and much-needed initiatives such as the Weatherization Assistance Program and this STAR Energy Program. Additionally, the proposal would increase funding for the Office of Science, which funds the 17 national laboratories, by $869 million from FY 2018 levels, eliminating the Advanced Research Program Agency, or /Energy, or ARPA-E. The budget proposal will also get rid of all DOE loan programs, including the Title 17 Innovative Clean Energy Projects Loan Program and the Advanced Technology Vehicle Manufacturing Loan Program. Mr. Secretary, this FY19 budget proposal reflects exactly the wrong vision for the nation, as it would take us backwards on critical issues like climate change, while also helping American innovation and global competitiveness. Mr. Secretary, again, I want to thank you for being here, and I look forward to working with you to address these important issues going forward. With that, I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the chair of the full committee for an opening statement. The gentleman from the good state of Oregon, Mr. Walden, for 5 minutes.
You know, last time it was the great state of Oregon.
I know.
I don't know how we slid down.
Michigan is the great state.
Oh,
Oregon's a good state.
I want to start, of course, by welcoming the Secretary, Mr. Vaughn. Thank you both for being here. I believe it's the Secretary's second visit before our committee. We appreciate that. We like regular visitors here. We don't give Hilton honor points or anything, but for your stays. But we do appreciate your being here, and especially to discuss the FY 2019 budget request from the President. As we've explored through the DOE modernization hearings, lots changed at the Department of Energy over the 40 years since it was first created, especially on the national security and energy front. And I know that's a passion of yours on cybersecurity, Mr. Secretary, and protecting our energy grid, our gas pipeline system, and all from attack. Under your leadership, Mr. Secretary, the department's undertaking a very ambitious set of reforms to strengthen our energy security, to reduce regulatory burdens, and to spur economic growth in America. Today's hearing will provide you with an opportunity to update the committee on the progress made toward achieving those goals, and to discuss how the budget request will help further DOE's mission to advance the national economic and energy security of the United States. As we've discussed before, DOE and Congress must work cooperatively to adapt management and mission priorities to reflect the realities of today's world. At my direction, Chairman Upton and Vice Chairman Barton have been working with Mr. Rush and others in terms of how do we organize the Department of Energy for the next generation. And we appreciate that work that is underway. And we also appreciate the work of your team, Mr. Secretary, to give us counsel and guidance from time to time as we work on legislation here to strengthen the physical security and cybersecurity of the nation's electric grid and pipelines and streamline the process for reviewing LNG export applications. Department of Energy has been a good partner, and we appreciate the testimony and your assistance in fine-tuning these bills. It's my expectation this constructive approach will continue to pay off as we dig deeper to address DOE's core missions of nuclear energy, environmental cleanup, and mission-enabling science. The President's FY 2019 budget requests $30.9 billion for the Department to deliver on its commitments to the American people. Almost half that budget would go toward the Department's nuclear security mission. Roughly a quarter would be spent on environmental management. The remaining amount would go toward DOE's energy and science programs. I'm pleased to see that the budget also includes funding to fulfill Department of Energy's legacy cleanup responsibilities, including at the Hanford site. Now, it's located along the Columbia River. You and I both went there last August, and I appreciated your doing that, and touring McNary Dam as well. The cleanup work at Hanford requires deliberate, careful, and very clear oversight by the Department of Energy, and we will continue to monitor the projects, particularly involving worker safety. And as we talked before the hearing, Mr. Secretary, I'd love to explore your views on what's happened recently there with some potential radiation emissions from dust and the effect on workers and the overall cleanup. While many technical and logistical challenges remain, we're beginning to see some progress, and I trust your renewed focus on Hanford will accelerate the results of cleaning up that mess. I'm pleased the budget includes funding to restart Yucca Mountain project. Mr. Shimkus also probably shares some happiness with that move. So the waste currently sited at Hanford and around the country will be permanently disposed of. That remains a big priority for this committee. We will get Yucca legislation to the floor. We passed it out here on a big bipartisan vote. We want to get it down to the President's desk. This year's budget request is notable in its emphasis on energy security, in particular in combating physical and cyber attacks to our nation's energy infrastructure. As the sector-specific agency for cybersecurity for the energy sector, Department of Energy must ensure unity of effort and serve as the day-to-day referral interface for the prioritization and coordination of activities across the government. As I said, I got a firsthand look at some of DOE's testing capabilities and unique facilities and advanced tools during a recent visit to the Idaho National Laboratory in Idaho Falls. Mike Simpson, my colleague from Idaho, and I were there. Your experts are working to protect our economy and safety of our citizens from hackers and who are waging a continuous cyber war on our critical infrastructure in this country. Just last month, for the first time ever, the Department of Homeland Security and the FBI jointly issued an alert formally accusing the Russian government of a widespread hacking campaign targeting a wide swath of our energy infrastructure, including our grid, pipelines, and nuclear facilities. I commend you, Mr. Secretary, for taking this threat as seriously as you do and for your efforts to improve the Department's ability to detect and respond to these emergency threats. While the Department works to keep the lights on in the event of a cyber attack, it's also working to improve the resiliency and reliability of the electric grid in the face of a rapidly changing power generation mix. So, Mr. Secretary, we appreciate that. I'll have questions for you about making sure that the Bonneville Power Administration remains a vibrant part of the Northwest infrastructure. I know the administration may have a different view on that, but we'll overcome that. So, thank you, Mr. Secretary. Delighted to have you here, and I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair would recognize the ranking member of the full committee, gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Secretary Perry, welcome back. I hope you feel welcome because judging by President Trump's fiscal year 2019 budget, I think here in Congress we have more confidence in you and your department than in the president. I say that because we recently passed a bipartisan omnibus appropriations bill that not only increased funding for many DOE programs above the president's budget request, but also increased funding above 2017 enacted levels. And I'm glad that Congress has gone on record that it will not accept these severe cuts being proposed by the president. I don't envy the position you're in today, having to defend a Department of Energy budget that slashes funding for clean energy research, walks away from popular efficiency programs that save consumers money, eliminates programs that fund cutting-edge energy research, and helps low-income families weatherize their homes. And this budget also slashes federal investments in DOE programs that help mitigate carbon emissions, which are, as the science clearly shows, the main drive of climate change. The president's budget proposes a particularly crippling 70% cut to DOE's Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. And that office has succeeded in growing clean energy technology deployment, developing cost-saving energy efficiency programs, and promoting advanced vehicles and alternate fuels. If we put the brakes on clean energy research, development, and deployment, we risk falling behind countries like China that are prioritizing clean energy investments that are spurring new industries and creating jobs. And this is not the way to grow and expand our economy, in my opinion. I'm also very concerned about the budget cuts to efficiency programs. My frustration is compounded by the fact that this administration has been slow-walking the publication of 4 product efficiency standards that were completed over a year ago. I simply do not understand why you would block the completion of these standards, which are cost-effective and will save consumers money. The standards have also been fully negotiated. A U.S. District Court has ordered DOE to finally publish these standards, but the Trump administration is currently wasting taxpayer money to appeal the order. The law requires DOE to publish these standards, and it should be done immediately. The budget proposal also makes several misguided changes to the structure of the Power Marketing Administrations, PMAs. It directs the federal government to sell off a large portion of the transmission system in several PMAs. It also requires the PMAs to charge consumers for electricity based on the rates of comparable private utilities instead of simply recouping costs. And both of these actions, I think, are ill-conceived and will lead to higher electricity bills for those who purchased electricity from a PMA, and that's clearly bad for consumers. Another proposal I find especially foolish is the president's plan to abolish the Northeast Gasoline Supply Reserve, which was launched after several gasoline shortages during Superstorm Sandy. The administration's reasoning for this short-sighted proposal, that the reserve, and I quote, has not been utilized since its establishment, by that logic, we might as well discard the federal government's stockpile of smallpox vaccines because the vaccines have not been used since the stockpile was created. And I've introduced legislation to authorize the reserve. I would prefer to work with you, Mr. Secretary, to perfect and move that legislation, but I certainly will fight any attempt to eliminate the reserve. And finally, I must address the recent request the Department received from First Energy and Murray Energy to use Section 202C of the Federal Power Act to keep the company's cash-strapped coal and nuclear plants operational. Mr. Secretary, judging by your recent statements and those of Assistant Secretary Walker, it sounds like you appreciate that Section 202C is for serious grid emergencies, as explicitly defined in the statute, and not designed to bail out power plants that are losing money. So this request by First Energy, in my opinion, is like calling 9/11 because your credit card got declined. It has united Republicans, Democrats, energy companies, environmental groups, regulators, and consumers in opposition because it's clearly and simply not just inappropriate, but I think illegal. So again, thank you for testifying before our committee today. I know you were here before, and believe me, we appreciate the fact that you as a cabinet member don't hesitate to come here. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman yields back, and I would just echo many of the positive comments from both sides of the aisle that we do appreciate your presence here and your frequent visits to Capitol Hill and ability to reach out again to both sides. And Mr. Secretary, you're recognized to give an opening statement, and then we'll proceed with questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Chairman Walden, thank you for your comments, and Ranking Member Rush, and belong to each of you. It's my privilege to be back in front of you again. And Mr. Rush, just as a side comment, I hope that we all can reflect a real civility and and frankly, brotherly and sisterly love as we go forward in this process. And it's my honor to get to serve this country once again in this role that I have today. And it's a great privilege to be interacting with each of you as public servants. You all sacrifice and to serve this country, and I'm greatly appreciative of that. This budget represents a request to the American people through their representatives in Congress to fund the priorities of this department. It underscores DOE's commitment to stewardship, accountability, service. I hope that our interactions with you and other committees of Congress over the past year have underscored that commitment. Our DOE leadership team has appeared before congressional committees 23 times in 2017, and we're proud of the strong relationship that we built on the Hill. When I first appeared before this committee last year, I committed DOE to advancing several key objectives. I noted that we needed to accelerate our exascale computing capability, to modernize our nuclear arsenal, to continue to address the environmental legacy of the Cold War, advance domestic energy production, better protect our energy infrastructure. This fiscal year 2019, $30.6 billion budget request for the department seeks to advance these and other goals. Mr. Chairman, DOE's supercomputing and other advanced technology capabilities play a crucial role in combating threats to our energy and national security infrastructure. As this committee knows, from its strong bipartisan support of the 21st Century Cures legislation, these supercomputing assets are also critical to finding cures for cancer, cardiovascular disease, and other health challenges. In the Precision Medicine Initiative section of the Cures Act, Section 2011, you encourage the Secretary of Health and Human Services to coordinate with the Secretary of Energy to identify and address the technology needs for the initiative. So last week I met with HHS Assistant Secretary for Health and the Surgeon General to discuss how we can work together to address these goals and further utilize our capacity to address similar health problems faced by American veterans. Mr. McNerney, you and I talked about this with a little more specificity, and I hope to be able to come up and sit down with you because I know that you have a very real interest in this particular area, and I just think there's extraordinary opportunity here. On a parallel track, DOE's been working with the VA to utilize information from millions of cancer patients' records to determine optimal treatment. We're now bringing these tools to bear on veterans' health issues, ranging from traumatic brain injury to suicide prevention, prostate cancer, cardiovascular disease. In addition, we recently announced a major RFP to accelerate our efforts to regain American leadership in supercomputing. The machines we will build and will deploy will be 50 to 100 times faster than any of our current computers and will hold immense potential to help answer the most challenging questions in science and medicine and national security. Regarding national security, let me say that the United States government has no greater or more solemn duty than to protect its citizens. Because nuclear deterrence is critical to our defense. Last year, we promised a much-needed upgrading of our arsenal. This year, we requested an 8.3% increase to align ourselves with the President's Nuclear Posture Review and the National Security Strategy. We also focused on addressing the environmental legacy left at the Department's sites, and this year, we're requesting additional funds for that obligation. We also have a duty to advance American energy independence. Thanks to ingenuity, innovation, we're on the cusp of realizing that objective. In the coming years, we will produce an abundance of energy from a diverse number of sources. Not only are we becoming energy independent, We're exporting to our friends, our allies, and our partners. Just last year, we became a net exporter of natural gas, and today we are exporting LNG to 27 countries on 5 different continents. And as our economy expanded and the energy development reached new heights, our environment became cleaner. From 2005 to 2017, we led the world in reducing carbon emissions, cutting them by 14% over that time. The lesson's clear. We don't have to choose between growing our economy and caring for our environment. And that's the heart of the new energy realism that I recently described. To drive further energy innovations, we're requesting continued funding for our energy program offices, as well as more funding for research in fossil fuels and nuclear power, including small nuclear reactors, the modular reactors. At the department, we have a duty to ensure our energy actually delivers to its place of use without interruption. Our national and economic security depend on a diversity of fuel sources and the ability to deliver electricity where and when consumers need it. My greatest focus as the Secretary of Energy is to ensure that our grid is not only reliable, but that it's resilient. That's why last year I promised to step up our efforts to protect and maintain America's energy infrastructure in the face of all hazards. The devastation caused by the 2017 hurricanes highlighted the importance of improving grid reliability and resilience in the face of natural disasters. We also need to protect from man-made attacks, including cyber attacks. So this year, we've requested funding increases to strengthen cyber security as well as the department's cyber defenses. We're also seeking to establish a new Office of Cyber Security, Energy Security, and Emergency Response, which will be led by a new Assistant Secretary. Now, since many of our nation's greatest energy breakthroughs have come through the work of our national laboratories, we need to ensure their ability to innovate. Meeting the people driving our innovation agenda and imploring them to reach even higher are some of the reasons I'm committed to visit each of our national labs. Thus far, I've visited 13 of those 17 labs and also visited other key DOE sites. At each site, one thing was made abundantly clear. Those who work for the department are patriots committed to serving the American people. In the end, it will be you, our elected representatives, who will decide how to best allocate the resources of our hardworking taxpayers. My pledge to you is that we will do our best to use those resources wisely and in pursuit of the vital goals that I've just outlined. Thank you, and it's my privilege again to be in front of you and to attempt to answer your questions.
Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. At this point, we'll move to questions from both sides. Appreciate, again, your presence here. I want to first ask, going back to what Chairman Walden said, the great state of Michigan, one of the reasons why it's such a great state is because of the Great Lakes. And I'd like to talk to you briefly about the Straits of Mackinac, which you know that we both deeply care about. About a week and a half ago, we learned that 2 high-voltage transmission cables that run under the straits near the Mackinac Bridge were destroyed by a ship's anchor and was taken out of service. Enbridge's Line 5, which carries not only crude oil, light crude, and also propane, also runs under the straits only a short distance away, was also struck by that same anchor, and the pipeline was damaged. It was a near miss. It could have been catastrophic for sure. And even though the strike on Line 5 did not cause an oil spill, that's something that we all worry about. Earlier, Governor Snyder and I reached an agreement with Enbridge, who maintains that line, to look at a number of options to replace that line. In my view, it needs to be directionally drilled in terms of a new line that needs to replace the existing line. I think, I know that they're looking at a number of different options, and particularly with the events of the last 2 weeks, it prompts us to try and expedite that process even faster. Couple questions I have. As I work with the governor's office and others, can you help us in looking at a replacement for this line as it relates to the permitting that would be required in other efforts within the administration to replace that Line 5 with a safer option than we have today?
Yes, sir. Well, the short answer is yes. But if I could just expand a moment, I think it's really important for us to recognize that our infrastructure, not only in some cases, as this one I would suggest, is aging, but also the expansion of that infrastructure to be able to take advantage of this new energy resource, if you will. 12 years ago, there was a fellow traveling around the country making a pretty good living giving a speech about peak oil. And the world has so changed, and America is in such a different position, and being able to move those resources safely and efficiently is really important to the economy and to the national security of this country.
Well, you might remember that there was an Enbridge pipeline break a number of years ago, and when that happened, we actually passed the Upton-Dingell bill, and John Dingell, and it passed with maybe one vote against it in the Congress. We upgraded all of the safety standards and fines for new pipelines. And one of the provisions in that bill, in fact, was that any new pipeline built that goes underneath a significant body of water, a major river, et cetera, certainly the Straits of Mackinac, would have to be buried underneath that lake or riverbed and not be trenched or simply laid on the top. So what I've been pushing Enbridge to do, and I know the governor is on board as well, is to actually go underneath and use that technology that's available today so that we can get this thing replaced. One other question relating to that, can you ask your Department of Energy and Reliability to actually study what would happen if this line went out for some type of duration? It leads to a major refinery over in Detroit, and then that oil is refined and wholesaled throughout the Midwest. And I'd like to know what the impact might be, particularly on the consumers. And if you could help us get that would be good.
I'll be happy to do that, Mr. Chairman. Your common sense, or let me put it this way, I think our common sense collectively tells us that if we lose a major line to a refinery like that, that it's going to have a negative impact, not only on the consuming public, but also I will suggest, and it's one of the things I think you're very wise to ask us to take a look at this, on the national security side of it. I don't know where that fuel goes in its final stages, but you'll have major military bases in that part of the country, and it could have a negative impact on their ability to have fuel available for the security of this nation.
The last question I have is, while we're talking about pipeline safety, I want to turn to the recent news regarding cyber attacks on pipelines. And as you know, that there was a published report just in the last week or two as to a cyber attack on one of our pipelines here. I know that that's almost a daily occurrence. Why is it so important that DOE take a strong role in coordinating the federal response? You may know that I have a bill, H.R. 5175, the Pipeline and LNG Facility Cybersecurity Preparedness Act, which would enhance DOE's ability to coordinate pipeline security and emergency response. Can you work with us as we move that bill forward?
Yes, sir. Obviously, the world has really changed from the standpoint of, and it's not just a few times, it's thousands of times a day that there are bad actors out there, whether they're nation states or whether they're just a single individual with ill intent in mind that are trying to penetrate into systems all across this country, some of them that could have catastrophic impact on our ability to deliver energy. It's the reason that we've asked for these additional funds to stand up this new office that we refer to as CSER, Cybersecurity. I want to thank Joe Barton for the work that he's done on REARG to help us from the standpoint of modernizing the agency to look at the changes that have just happened, let's say in the last decade in this country relative to the new energy resources we have available, the infrastructure that we're going to need, and the security and resiliency of that infrastructure, obviously including the grid that's out there.
Thank you very much. Would yield to the ranking member, Mr. Rush.
I want to thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, again, I want to thank you for agreeing to meet with me in the near future to discuss ways that we can ensure that the Department of Energy reflects the nation's diversity, not only within the mid-level staff levels, but also within the highest levels of the decision-making process and position. With your help, Mr. Secretary, I want to ensure that we have diverse perspectives structurally in the most critical areas. And these areas include, within your office, the Institutional Review Board, the Energy Advisory Board, the Senior Executive Service Staff, and of course at the highest levels of the national labs. That said, Mr. Secretary, what is the justification for cutting the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy by 70% from FY18 levels? As you know, energy efficiency is one of the few issue items that enjoys widespread bipartisan support here in the Congress. Initiatives like the Weatherization Assistance Program are extremely popular, not only with policy makers here, but really all across the country, as it helps to conserve energy while also lowering utility bills for low-income families. Why is the administration proposing to cut or completely eliminate these critical programs?
Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, thank you. Let me address, you asked two questions on the focus on minorities and minorities at the DOE. I think we are focused on that. 27% of our entire enterprise is made up by minorities. I think it's really important to bring to the committee's attention that we also have a focus on small business contracting at the laboratories so that women-owned and minority-owned businesses have the expertise to be able to make their way through the myriad contracting issues that are there. One of the other things I'm really proud of is that we have a program that the DOE to promote diversity in the STEM area back in both high schools and colleges to be able to get young, diverse members of our society pointed in the right direction: engineering, math, science, technology, those. And I'm really proud of what DOE is doing in that line. And I want to come and sit down with you in your office and talk more about this and the ways that we can do better. Let me shift over to the EERE and to your concerns. And I heard Mr. Pallone's concerns as well, dealing with EERE and the reductions there. And I want to try to explain them in this way, and then have one comment at the end of that. One of the things that we have seen is that as technologies become more mature, for instance, both solar and wind, and I try to remind folks that while I was the governor of Texas, we produced more wind energy than any other state in the nation, passed up every state in the country, produced more wind energy but 5 countries. And I'm committed to having that diverse portfolio. But those are now becoming mature in the sense of their marketability and going to the market and being commercialized. So the dollars that have historically been spent to bring those up to the place where they can be mature, we don't feel like those dollars need to be expended. Now, are there other areas that we need to be focused on? And yes, grid integration is a great example of it. Energy storage, kind of beyond batteries, if you will. Another DOE area that we're focusing on is in hydrogen R&D. those are early stage, and that's where you're going to see us focused with the dollars. So, you know, we will always, you know, have a give and take back and forth about, are you spending enough here, are you spending enough there, and I respect that. As a farmer appropriator, as a farmer agency head, and then as a CEO, as a governor, I really respect the authorizers, the appropriators, and the administrative side, or the executive side of this. I know what my job is, and my job is to work with you, which I will do on a daily basis, to find that appropriate ground. But I will promise you this, that where you appropriate and where you authorize, we will work to make you very proud that we've managed it absolutely the most efficient way that it can be.
You're right, Mr. Chairman.
Sure, recognize the gentleman from Oregon, good state.
We're not even good state now. Thanks.
Mr. Wallace,
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Mr. Secretary, again, thank you for being here. Before I say anything, we should also draw attention to the fact it's Mr. Wahlberg's birthday today. So happy birthday from Michigan, the great state of Michigan. Mr. Secretary, I want to start by talking about Bonneville Power Administration. I appreciate your just most recent comments about respecting the will of the authorizers, which is what we are. So, along those lines, this idea of selling off the electric transmission assets and abandoning cost-based rates, the proposal has been roundly rejected by virtually every member of the Pacific Northwest congressional delegation. It is the one idea, bad idea, that unites all of us in the Northwest. I'm afraid this move could do nothing but harm my constituents, drive up electricity costs, hurt consumers across the region. So, can you assure me the DOE will leave Bonneville alone unless Congress provides explicit authorization? That authorization word again there, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Now, moving along. As you know, the Hanford site is just across the river from many of my constituents, and not only are safe and secure operations a concern, and I appreciate your commitment not only to that and the lab nearby, but also the help to do the cleanup here. The committee right now is working with the GAO to identify some options for improving operational performance. Will you work with us on this as we develop findings?
Yes, sir.
Thank you. Let me ask a broader question. As we look at modernizing the department, we're focusing on emergency and security issues, but also how the department can better expend its limited resources. We're also cognizant of the department's vast technological capabilities, which can help accelerate innovation across national security, energy, manufacturing, even medicine, as you've referenced in your testimony. But we also have to watch our taxpayers' wallets. Can you speak to your support of DOE's science, technology, computing facilities and how best to enable innovation in the private sector while attentively managing limited taxpayer resources? How are you going to balance all that? Because your labs are doing amazing work. It is phenomenal. And for our committee members, if you haven't interacted with these labs, we should figure out a way to do that and get some briefings. It is really terrific, the work that's being done there. So, Mr. Secretary, what can you tell us about how to balance all that and where you're headed in terms of the direction of the labs? And,
Technology transfer is, I think, one of the real goals of this agency from the standpoint of working with the labs, and we're consolidating the EERE's tech-to-market functions over in the Office of Technology Transfer. And just as a bit of a background, I have a fairly substantial amount of experience with that. We created some programs while I was the governor of Texas, the Emerging Technology Fund, which basically is taking very, very early stage technology and getting it to the market. So I've had some experience of dealing with that as the governor of Texas, which, you know, I'm not going to say this is apples to apples, but the point is we have in place the Office of Technology Transfer, and it's looking at how to coordinate best practices across the complex and to, you know, whether it's agreement provisions and abilities to consider equities in licensing. I mean, there's a host of areas, and I don't want to drill down all that deep, but the point is, we are sensitive to one of our goals in a limited budget situation is to be able to help these technologies get to maturation, if you will, or at least to the point where they're ready to be commercialized in the private sector.
All right, good. And in conclusion, for my few minutes here, this work on reorganizing and modernizing the structure of your agency is something that I take seriously. It's a goal for our committee, and I know Mr. Barton is leading that effort and working with Mr. Rush and others to get that done. So we take it seriously here. We want you to know that. We look forward to a partnership to look at how to reauthorize, modernize the agency. Our committee's got a pretty good track record looking at other agencies, and like the FCC, we reauthorized for the first time since 1990. Your agency's one that goes back before that, and so we look forward to work, continuing to work with you on that effort, and so we want to move forward. I'll thank the chairman for this hearing and return the balance of my time.
Gentleman yields back. Chair will recognize the gentleman from New Jersey, Mr. Pallone.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, how many LNG export applications to non-free trade agreement countries are currently pending before the DOE, if you will?
19, correct? I think there's 19.
19. Do you believe that
Let me,
Yeah.
I'll get you the,
Yeah, I'll accept that, and if you want to get back to me if you think it's slightly wrong, please do. Do you believe that the DOE should continue to have a role in approving the LNG export applications, yes or no?
yes, sir.
And does the EPA, now I'm talking about the EPA, does the EPA play any role in DOE's public interest determination process, yes or no?
I'm sure they do, but I'm no expert on how the EPA functions, sir.
Okay. Well, whether or not you agree that the U.S. government should be promoting exports of American LNG, that is an activity that would clearly fall within the mission of your department, or maybe the Department of Commerce. But as you know, I think late last year, EPA Administrator Scott Pruitt traveled to Morocco to pitch that country on buying LNG from the U.S. Obviously, I'm very concerned that that doesn't fall within the EPA's mission. Do you think that this falls within EPA's mission?
Mr. Pallone, I'm going to leave that up to you. I try to stay in my lane as best I can. So, again, as I shared with you, I don't know what EPA's statutory responsibility and authorizations are relative to promoting energy sales and or what else might have been going on that I don't know about on that trip. So I think it would be a little inappropriate for me to be making a public or private observation about that.
All right. Well, let me just ask, I think I know your answer, but did you or your department have any role in Mr. Pruitt's Morocco trip?
Again, there may have been some staff-to-staff level conversations that I'm not privy to, but from the standpoint of secretary to secretary, I don't recall any conversations relative to an EPA trip to Morocco.
All right, thank you. I just wanted to point out that when Administrator Pruitt testified before this committee late last year, he used the phrase core mission many times and argued that he was working to take EPA back to focusing on its basic responsibilities. And I found it strange that Administrator Pruitt thinks that visiting foreign countries to promote the sale of fossil fuels from private companies falls within the EPA's core mission. I don't think it does. But let me ask you a second question, Mr. Secretary. I note that the department has established a web page and email address to accept public comments and requests regarding emergency must-run orders under the Federal Power Act, Section 202C. And I'm supportive of efforts to expand public participation in government processes. However, I don't see anything on that web page that indicates that these comments, whether as is or redacted, will be posted for the public to see. If you want me to repeat this, I will, but I'm basically trying to get a commitment from you to posting the comments you receive on your website, or at the very least, providing this committee in real time the comments you received on this matter for all of us here to review. Is that something you can commit to?
Yes, sir. And I think we have I think we have a place for public comments because this 202C is just now being analyzed, and I don't think we even have a process in place yet for the
Well,
public.
you do have on the website a page and email address to accept public comments and requests regarding the Federal Power Act, Section 202. But I just want to make sure that they'll be posted for the public to see. That's what I'm asking.
Yes, sir. We will.
All right. All right. Thank you so much. I yield back.
Chair recognizes the Vice Chair of the Energy Subcommittee, gentleman from Texas. Good state of Texas. Oh, Mr. Barton, I'm sorry. Mr. Barton. I recognize Mr. Barton, the Vice Chair of the full committee.
All right, well, sometimes there are too many Texans, right?
Mr. Barton, whose picture is right above you on the right, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Is Mr. Upton's is right up there.
You want me to go
First
again?
of all, welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, sir.
I think you and I should acknowledge at the beginning that our basketball team got hammered by Mr. Upton's team in the Sweet 16.
1 point.
We got beat 27 points. My Lord, they put it to us. So I know I can't speak for Secretary Perry, but I wasn't real happy that afternoon to watch that.
Thinking about Houston, that was the three-pointer there.
Yeah, the game before you barely won, but you put the wood to us. Anyway, we're glad to have you, Mr. Secretary.
Yes, sir.
I am tempted to go down the rabbit hole that Mr. Pallone introduced about your colleague at the EPA, but I don't think so. I will say on my own behalf that any cabinet secretary that encourages things that are of strategic interest to the United States of America in his overseas travels is not necessarily a bad thing. And I am glad to learn that Mr. Pallone agrees that there are limits to what EPA should be involved with. So in that sense, it was a good exchange. I want to ask a few budget questions, but I want to ask one policy question. You probably can't read this. This is today's business section of the Wall Street Journal. It says oil hits highest price since 2014. I'm sure you read that before you came up here. And inside it has another article about Treasury bonds are beginning to inch up and tension in the marketplace over that. What, if anything, should the Department of Energy, under your stewardship, do with the Strategic Petroleum Reserve to try to, I'm not going to say manage the market, but make sure our oil prices don't go too high in the near term, if anything?
Well, Mr. Chairman, I think one of the things that DOE needs to do and can do from the standpoint of making sure that there is a ready supply of energy, whether it's renewables, whether it's hydro, whether it's nuclear, whether it's coal, whether it's natural gas. The Strategic Petroleum Reserve, I think you bring up a really interesting opportunity for this body and for Congress and the administration to have and obviously the public, to have an open conversation about, is the SPRO, the way that it is structured today, the proper structure? Is there enough, too much? Is the operation of it on a yearly basis, the cost of the upkeep of that in our best interest? I'll leave that to all of us collectively to have that conversation, but it was put in place after World War II, and there may be after the the shortages of the 70s, when we saw the need for that really exploding, if you will. And I think the question now is that with the resources that the United States has, with the new innovation, with the new energy portfolio that we have, does the Strategic Petroleum Reserve need to stay in its current form? I'm not ready to sit here and tell you I know the answer to that, but I think it's important that issue that you brought up, that we need to have that conversation.
The GAO has done a study of the Strategic Petroleum Reserve, and it basically says we need to do more study. You and I are going to meet next week, and I think we're also going to have the staffs begin to meet also with our friends on the minority side, and that'll be something that we bring up. I've got a few quick, just dollar questions since this
Try
is
to give you yes and no answers.
Yeah. Do you support us funding Yucca Mountain? Us, the government, funding Yucca Mountain? I hope you say yes.
The dollars that you all are going to appropriate, we will spend efficiently and appropriately. Yes.
Yeah, okay, finally. We've got a Northeast home heating oil reserve that I put into a bill with Congressman Markey back in about 10 years ago. We spend $10 million a year on it. It's never been used. Is that maybe something we could save a little money on?
Well, certainly, you know, when you have dollars sitting in an account that's not being used, it's
Something to look at.
Yes.
Okay. And you've got $159 million in your budget for something called legacy management. Do you happen to know what that is?
Yes, sir. Those are areas that older facilities that on the cleanup side.
Okay.
That's over in EM.
I am very proud that you knew what it was.
Yes, sir. The Cold War cost a lot of money,
So
as
I
did the Manhattan Project. Still costing us a lot of money, but it was worth it,
See if we can
sir.
save some money there. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from California, Mr. McNerney.
I thank the chairman. Mr. Secretary, I really appreciate your interest in veterans issues, in particular using science and computing power to make advances in PTSD and traumatic brain injuries and other veteran-centric issues, and I look forward to any collaboration
Yes, sir.
between us in the future. There's two issues I want to bring up today. One is resiliency of the electric grid, especially in face of the wildfires we had in California and other threats that we're seeing, and the ARPA-E funding. Regarding resilience, does the DOE have any tools to help ensure resilience despite some of the gaps we have in our current law? Are there any tools that we can use, that you can use to help us make our grid more resilient to these things in California and elsewhere?
Well, obviously, the test grid, if you will, at Idaho National Lab is one of the resources that we have available, where we can literally go in and break that grid and to see what happens and how to address it. You know.
Well, I think, what I'm really thinking about is federal tools to work with between the DOI and the Federal Forest Service to ensure rights of way so that brush can be cleared in federal lands, those kind of things.
I'm sorry. I was going down a different
Sure.
path here. Let me get back to you. I don't, off the top of my head, know that we have any resources available for that specific
Or authorities.
or authority. Yes, sir.
Thank
But
you.
I will get back to you.
Well, the current budget proposal reduces funding for resilience and reliability from $89 billion in 2017 to $61 billion in 2019. And we've seen an increase in some of these threats, wildfires, hurricanes, storms, and so on. So that budget direction seems to be going in the wrong way. I mean, I think we need increase in that. So that's a point of
Yes, sir.
a recommendation.
Mr. McNerney, I don't want to quibble with you about the issue of is it a reduction of dollars, or one of the things that we have done, I believe, in that particular line item is that we bifurcated it, and that's where cyber security, and we split that historic line item up and are creating this new office of of cybersecurity, emergency response, and that's got an 8.3% increase. Yes, sir, I think that's right. It's got a substantial increase over on that side, and you may be seeing the EERE budget that is lower, but the commitment to resiliency and to reliability, from my perspective, is actually increased. And so let me come over and sit down with you, and we can look at this a little closer to make sure that I know what you want to do. Sure. And I want to get to the same place that you are, and I think the membership wants to get from the standpoint of making sure that we have the resiliency, the reliability in our grid.
And of course, then that applies to the whole country, not just to California.
Yes, sir.
Regarding ARPA-E, this program is designed to help keep the United States at the forefront of energy innovation. I think that's a key element in ensuring our strong market position on energy issues. How determined is the administration in eliminating this program?
It shows up on the budget. I'm a good enough historian to understand that we're going to do what the Congress wants to do on this. As a former CEO of the state of Texas, I put some budgets forward from time to time that actually had 0 line items in them. And
It's kind of the same answer you gave 6 months ago. So.
yes, sir, and that was not particularly well received by the appropriators.
Okay, Mr. Secretary, do you support robust funding for fusion energy research and development?
Yes, sir.
Well, thank you. Your predecessor was deeply involved in the negotiations for the Iran nuclear agreement. This administration has considered scrapping that agreement. Are you involved in those deliberations?
Well, being on the National Security Council, yes, sir, to some degree. I would not put myself as the lead negotiator, but certainly am involved with the conversations generally in rooms that we can't be having conversations with here.
Can you disclose your opinion on that?
Well, I think like any of our deals, whether it's NAFTA, whether it's JCPOA, whether it's the negotiations that are ongoing with Saudi Arabia for a civil nuclear agreement, we need to get the best agreement that we can get. I think one of our main responsibilities is to, in the nonproliferation area, is to make sure that the fewer individuals who have access to those types of materials that can be made into weapons, we need to restrict that.
I mean, the agreement's already in place.
I understand that, but so's NAFTA, and we're renegotiating NAFTA. So I think the administration's point is, can we re-engage and get a better deal? I don't have a problem in the world with that, no matter what it might be, whether it's NAFTA, whether it's JCPOA. I mean, renegotiating. I mean, we got people renegotiating LNG deals that they signed 3 years ago.
I think the chairman's going to cut us off here, so
know.
thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Chair would recognize now the Vice Chair of the powerful Energy Subcommittee, Mr. Olson from the great state of Texas.
I thank the chair. And Secretary Perry, a big old Texas howdy.
Howdy.
It's great to have you back before the panel. As a personal note, I'm glad you did not leave DOE for VA as was rumored. Houston, Texas are happy to have your hat hang where it's hanging today.
Sir.
I want to talk about Section 202C of the Federal Power Act. I was one of the members of the last Congress to lead an effort to amend Section 202C. That change was signed into law. The intent was limited, talking about, quote, continuance of war, end quote, or a, quote, sudden increase in demand for electricity energy or a shortage of electric energy, end quote. There have been proposals to help fading coal and nuclear plants through Section 202C. I support coal and nuclear power. And I believe we have to have a diverse grid. Hurricane Harvey showed that dramatically. In my district, as you know, Energy's Parish Power Plant has 4 coal generators and 4 natural gas generators. 50 inches of rain or more wiped out that coal, made it wet. They ramped up natural gas production at that facility. 40 miles south is the South Texas Nuclear Power Plant in Bay City. That never had a flicker despite having the brunt of Harvey's force. Could you please talk about your view of Section 202C and the powers it gives you?
Yes, sir. If I may, I'd like to go back and just, if I could, very quickly clarify is a conversation with Mr. Pallone where we talked about the email address on the 202C comments, and we have an address that's on our website that is the destination for correspondence for this and future applications. So it's not a formal comment period because there has been no formal comment opened up. So I just wanted to clarify that. The 202C is in place, and I think you did a very good job, Mr. Olson, of basically laying out why a 202C could be used in this case. When we look at national security in particular, if you're in New York City and Wall Street were to lose power, I think anyone would say that puts our national security in jeopardy. We have military bases in a lot of different places around the country that rely upon their energy from the grid. Losing power to that grid would put our national security at risk. So this administration looks at the national grid and the resiliency of it, as well as the reliability of it as a national security issue. Having a very broad portfolio of renewables, of natural gas, of coal, of nuclear, of hydro, those are, we think, instrumental in being able to send the message across this country that whether it's in your private life or whether it's in your public life, and I'm talking about national security at that particular point in time versus, you know, why should anyone be put in a situation of having to choose between turning the lights on and keeping my family warm? And this administration believes strongly that if we don't have a diverse portfolio and to try to keep these plants online, obviously doing it with as sensitive activity as we can to the environment. And again, in my opening remarks, I made a comment that we've 14% decrease in carbon emissions in this country. That's leading the world. So the innovation and the technology that we have coming across out of this country, but it is imperative that we don't allow political decisions to be made relative to our our power security in this country.
Yes, sir. One further question on India. I went there last week on a mission to talk about LNG being exported to the great nation of India. And they were gushing. Guess who's coming this week or the next couple days? Secretary Rick Perry. You'll find out that Prime Minister Modi has a very aggressive plan to clean up their extremely dirty air. And that's with renewables, mostly wind and solar. But the energy minister and their foreign secretary stated over and over that LNG, natural gas, is the economy of the now. The future is renewables. As you know, we've had a private contract between Cheniere and a group called GAIL there in India to export approximately 7 metric tons of liquefied natural gas over the next 20 years. We agreed that to make this viable, to make that transition they want to make, they have to have better battery power, better storage, and better power lines, and also make wind viable. So I want you to take that technology message to them. We're going to help you. And so any comments about your trip to India?
Yes, sir. 2 weeks ago, the first molecules of U.S. Natural gas arrived at Gale. I think the issue for them is to build out their infrastructure to be able to move that the gas around, not unlike, Mr. Chairman, what we've got in this country. Yeah, we're way ahead of them, but the point is, if you're really going to be able to satisfy the economic needs and satisfy the national security needs of your people, you're going to have the distribution system as well. So that's another area. U.S. Pipeline technology, U.S. pipeline companies, I think there's a real opportunity in not just India, but India is obviously a huge market. And our ability to deliver U.S. innovation, U.S. natural resources into that country are a great opportunity, and that's the real driving factor of why we're headed that way.
Namaste. Yield back.
Chair would recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Peters.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. I have the exact quote I'll just read to you. When I asked you last about the budget proposed by the president, you said, I didn't write this budget. My job is to defend it, which from time to time is counter to what I think is good. So I know you're here to do a job, but maybe we can get some of your personal opinions on this. The budget makes cuts to the Office of Science, which includes an important project named the International Thermonuclear Experimental Reactor, which is sometimes referred to as ITER. Here's a program where the United States is one in an international partnership developing the energy of the future by proving we can make fusion work. The U.S. contributes 9% of the project funding, but 80% of it's spent in the United States, and we get access to 100% of the intellectual property. And perhaps most important, when the technology is proven, we can be part of the group that has ownership with monetizing capabilities instead of being a country that has to buy into the group. So with all these benefits, why does the budget cut contributions to ITER?
Mr. Peters, I think the basic messaging here on the reduction in that line item was, this is my observation, just being a manager and having been in negotiations before, it was really poorly managed. And I think you know that, you all have been briefed on it. The previous management of ITER was very, very poor. They wasted a lot of money. And they have new management in there. Mr. Barrow came over and we sat down and discussed this. I was impressed with his focus, his understanding, his recognition of the poor management before. We have, as a matter of fact, out of your district, a couple of projects that are being funded. The Solenoid, $75 million, and I think another aspect of the project that's ongoing, that General Atomics is the deliverer, the manufacturer of, and we certainly support that and are funding that. But with that said, if this committee and if Congress in a whole get comfortable, along with obviously the administration, that it is headed in the right direction, we will make sure that the U.S. dollars that are expended there are expended properly, and that there's good oversight, and that we have the proper outcomes that we'd be looking for.
I appreciate the comment about the management. That's fair. Now that we've improved that, I certainly hope we appreciate the leverage that we get out of this potential. And so just outside my district, San Diego Gas and Electric built and it runs the largest lithium-ion battery in the world as part of its grid operations. It's proving that projects like this can be a valuable part of the grid, particularly for resiliency and safety. How does the DOE budget ensure new technologies for grid resiliency can be implemented and tested properly?
Yeah, and that goes right to the heart of our both the Office of Science, Paul DeBar, who is now the Assistant Secretary there. I've got great faith in his focus, and particularly we're supporters of, I've said before, the battery storage, the holy grail of electric power. I believe that. DOE and DOE labs, working with private sector organizations like your constituents or right outside of your district, are going to be key to that. So I'm confident that what's happening in our national labs, the funding of those is appropriate to meet the needs of the battery challenges that face us.
Thank you. And just with respect to NAFTA, do you think that the disruption of NAFTA will have a negative impact on energy prices for Americans and supplies for U.S. energy companies who sell to Mexico and Canada, even the way we talk about it right now?
Not necessarily. I think I think generally speaking, people are able to divorce the rhetoric with reality. For instance, Ray Washburn, who's the head of OPIC, he and I have had conversations with my counterpart in Mexico and private sector operators in the U.S. and their Mexican counter partners, if you will, to invest in Mexico's energy infrastructure. So I feel confident. I think there's an extraordinary opportunity there.
I'm going to run out of time. I appreciate what you say about rhetoric. I got to tell you that NAFTA is so important to our country and to my district in particular. And I understand the talk about improving it. I think we had more leverage when we were dealing with 11 other countries. We could offer more to Mexico. But I certainly don't want to go backwards. And some of the talk it looks like rhetoric is turning into policy, and it concerns me. I just want to express that to you.
Mr. Peters, just as an aside, every time I see Ambassador Lighthizer, I tell him, we got to get a deal. Get a good deal, but we got to get a deal.
Mr. Latta.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thanks very much for being with us again today. Really appreciate seeing you. And I think it's really important because I also, in reading your testimony about cybersecurity, is a big issue. And in recent weeks, we have read news stories about malicious agents working to undermine the safety and security of our nation's energy infrastructure. According to the Department of Homeland Security, this includes Russian cyber attacks that have remotely targeted the power grid, energy, nuclear, and commercial facilities and critical manufacturing sectors. More recently, we have seen cyber attacks against the electronic communication systems of several American pipeline companies. DHS is still working to determine who is responsible for these specific attacks. And I believe from your response from the chairman of the subcommittee, the gentleman from Michigan, that you would agree that more needs to be done to address these attacks on our energy infrastructure. Is DOE working with DHS to identify the vulnerabilities that were exploited through these attacks and rectifying them? And if so, can you tell us what might be done and what's being done?
Well, there's nothing more essential to America's national interest, and for that matter, our national and security than our energy supply. The Department of Energy plays a very important role with that. We're the specific agency that deals with the energy side of it, particularly grid security. But we're also working with the other sectors, or not the other sectors, but the other agencies as well. DHS, Department of Transportation, and DHS and Transportation Department lead cybersecurity support to pipelines. DOE works closely with them and other departments, and we have some other stakeholders to protect the energy sector, including the secure transport of our oil and gas. So we recognize the real challenges there. One of the reasons that we're asking for the additional dollars to stand up this office of cybersecurity that we refer to as CSER, S-E-R, is so that we can focus the resources, use our national labs, working with these other agencies of government to assure the American people that we have done everything within reason possible to protect the American people from these cyber attacks that are only increasing in intensity and frequency.
Thank you. Given the nature of these threats, I believe it is more important than ever that the Congress acts. That's why I've worked with my colleague, Representative McNerney, to introduce two bipartisan pieces of legislation to address the threat of cyber attacks. These two bills, H.R. 5239, the CyberSense Act, and H.R. 5240, the Enhancing Grid Security through Public-Private Partnership Act, were the subject of a legislative hearing held in this subcommittee last month. Under H.R. 5239, the Secretary of Energy would be directed to establish a voluntary CyberSense program to identify and promote cyber-secure products intended for the use in the bulk power system. And do you believe that this policy would help improve the safety and security of our energy infrastructure and address these threats?
It certainly on its face sounds like it. We will work with you in any way that we can to flesh out any details and information that we have privy to.
I greatly appreciate that. Thank you. And along with with Representative McNerney, I'm also the co-chair of the Grid Innovation Caucus here in the House. The purpose of this caucus is to discuss the challenges facing the electric grid and come up with ways that we can enhance its capabilities and securities. In addition to guarding against the threat of cyber attacks, will you go into more detail about other ways which DOE is trying to improve the electric grid's capabilities to protect it from these cyber attacks?
Yes, sir. We'll work with you.
I greatly appreciate it. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. I yield back the balance of my time.
Gentleman from Pennsylvania is recognized.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, welcome back.
Mr. Dole.
Like many on this panel, I'm greatly concerned by the premature closures of nuclear plants around this country. John Hanger, who was our former Secretary of the DEP in Pennsylvania and head of the Public Utility Commission in my state, put it succinctly. He said there are now 18 nuclear units that have closed or are scheduled for closure in the last 5 years. 3 are in my state of Pennsylvania, Beaver Valley 1 and 2, and 3 Mile Island. Those 3 nuclear units generated 22 terawatt hours of energy in 2017. All the wind and solar in Pennsylvania generated 4 terawatt hours in 2017. This is putting my state at the edge of a clean air climate disaster. Secretary Perry, I echo his concerns and would add that these nuclear power plants not only provide good family supporting jobs, but also affordable, reliable, and greenhouse gas-free electricity. I just saw an interesting study that's come out by a think tank, The Third Way, that takes a look at the effect of these retirements of the nuclear portfolio and how it affects our ability to meet our climate change goals, to reduce greenhouse gases by 80% below 2005 levels by 2050. It would be virtually impossible for us to make that up, because as every nuclear plant retires, even if we start, greatly upping our renewables, they'd have to make up for that loss before we start to add more carbon-free energy to our cycle. So I think it's a real problem. I know First Energy recently filed this 202C request with your department, and I saw you quoted as saying that that may not be the most appropriate and efficient way to deal with this, but it's not the only way. And while I applaud your caution on the 202C request, I'm curious what other options you think are on the table. Is this something that can be settled at DOE or in Congress or at FERC? What are the other ways that this might be dealt with?
Mr. Dole, let me just say you are absolutely correct and very prescient in your observation about this country and the ability to deliver the energy needs with the premature, in particular, taking offline of coal and nuclear plants. I, like you, share a great concern about our ability to stay economically viable, but more importantly, from a national security standpoint, of taking care of...
And an environmental standpoint, if we're ever going to meet our goals for climate change.
Absolutely. So to address the specific question, if you'll recall, I want to say 6-7 months ago, we put a 403 request into the Federal Electric or Energy Regulatory Commission, to FERC, which we thought was an appropriate way to address this. They obviously did not. The 202C is an option. I'd like to work with you and members of Congress on any other options that that are out there, that are reasonable, that are that get the result of which we need. And the result, from my perspective, is a diverse portfolio. And let me just add, I think it's really important for this country to have a civil nuclear program in place. Too many previous administrations made some decisions that, from my perspective, put particularly the nuclear energy industry in jeopardy. And we now see the results of that, whether it was regulations, whether it was not supporting them in various...
Mr. Secretary, I'd be happy to work with you on ideas to ensure that we keep our nation's leading source of carbon-free power online. Let me ask you another question. Existing energy markets, they don't seem to consider the environmental attributes of nuclear power, but there are some states like New York and Illinois that have implemented strategies focused on ensuring that the environmental benefits of nuclear are recognized. Other states, including mine in Pennsylvania, are considering similar strategies, but I understand that some parties are proposing rule changes at PJM that could punish these states by making it more difficult for certain plants or units to participate in the markets. Do you think that's good policy?
I think any policy that restricts your diversity of your energy portfolio is not necessarily good policy. I think it's short-sighted.
I see my time's up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. Mr. Shimkus.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, welcome. Since you appeared before us, our nation's nuclear waste management has passed few notable anniversaries. December marked the 35th anniversary of passage of the Nuclear Waste Policy Act of 1982, which formalized the federal government's nuclear waste management program, as well as the 30th anniversary when Congress designated Yucca Mountain in Nevada, the site as the location of our nation's first repository. Of greater consequence, January 31st marked the 20th anniversary from the year in which DOE was legally required to take title to spent nuclear fuel for disposal at Yucca Mountain. Since then, American taxpayers have been paying billions of dollars to manage spent nuclear fuel in 121 communities around the country. Secretary Perry, I'd like to run through a few numbers with you quickly, and you probably know some of these, and if we can just kind of stick to numbers, because I got another question I want to get to. As of the end of fiscal year 2017, what is the approximate amount of ratepayers paid into the Nuclear Waste Fund to construct, oversee our nuclear waste management program?
It's approaching $40 billion. I think it's about 37.7 billion.
And those are ratepayers, people from states that have
That's
nuclear power that have paid in to
correct.
solve this problem. How much did the value of the Nuclear Waste Fund increase during fiscal year 2017?
Almost 2 billion. I think 1.7 billion is the specific.
That's the accrued interest on the base of the account. As of the end of fiscal year 2017, what is the total cumulative liability cost, including future payments, because Yucca Mountain is not yet open?
Just a touch over $34 billion.
So that's payments that we're liable for because we're not complying with law.
That's correct.
And you're saying in the 30+ billion.
Yep.
How much did American taxpayers pay in legal costs during the fiscal year 2017 because Yucca Mountain is not open?
$700 million.
So for my colleagues, we moved this bill. This is an issue I'm fighting with appropriators and budgeteers. This is money that taxpayers are paying that's really not on the books. And it accrues to almost $800 million. What was the total increase in fiscal year 2017 in taxpayer liability in both actual payments as well as future projected liabilities?
Well, that one grew substantially, $3.3 billion.
If you break this total cost down to a daily cost to taxpayers that escalated during just last year, how much are taxpayers liable for on a daily basis?
$9 million per day.
That's a day. That's money that we could do, help our national defense, Title I programs, anything. That's just being paid because we're not complying with the law. So when people wonder why I get so focused, these are some of the reasons why. Last question in this area. How much was provided to the department in fiscal year 2017, and I think I can add 2018 now, from the Nuclear Waste Fund for DOE to move forward with our nuclear waste program and ultimately reduce our taxpayers' legal payments. That's a zero, I'm assuming. Not a one, it's a zero.
That's a zero.
Okay, and that's our liability as authorizers to push our appropriators to do.
And I think,
what-
Mr. Shimkus, that's the reason that we requested, the administration requested $110 million for the legal process to go forward to be able to get the answer of whether or not this facility is, in fact, what you all in Congress have said it is.
Yeah, so the appropriation money is really to do the final adjudication with the Nuclear Regulatory Commission, with you as an intervener, with the state of Nevada to clarify the science. And that's the last part before we can then really start moving and addressing this. With my 30 seconds left, I won't read the whole question, but you talked about the DOE and the great work it does. Obviously, I'm also very much engaged in renewable fuel debate in this country. DOE has done a lot of good work on a study. I've quoted it before, the Co-Optima study. Are you familiar with it, and what's your thoughts on it?
No, say it again, sir.
The Co-Optima study.
not.
It's the high octane. It basically is addressing that high octane issue. We have a hearing tomorrow.
I will get up to speed on it and get back with you.
Not a problem. I appreciate your time. Thank you.
Conversation, yes, sir.
Gentlelady from Florida.
Thank you, Chairman Upton. Good morning, Secretary Perry. Yesterday in our Oversight Committee, we had Bruce Walker, your Assistant Secretary of Electricity Delivery and Energy Reliability, who gave us an update on restoration of the grid in Puerto Rico, and I think everyone was very heartened by what he had to say and what the department is doing to build a more resilient grid, a more modern grid, tapping the expertise of our national laboratories and working with private sector partners and researchers there on the ground. And now Congress has provided the funds and overridden some of the language in the Stafford Act that says you have to just rebuild what was there, which will, if we did that, that would not protect the taxpayer. So thank you, and we'll be watching for the modeling he said is necessary to do something very innovative there. But then we get the budget request, and I'm very concerned about how anti-consumer the administration's budget request is by eliminating our weatherization initiatives and energy efficiency initiatives that really help put money back in the pockets of consumers. This will hurt real people out there in the world. And then it's a budget request that sidelines science with devastating proposed cuts to clean energy research, smart grid, R&D, and energy storage. And I think in doing this kind of budget request really seeds America's leadership. And it says to consumers, you're going to have to pay more. And you know how competitive we are out there in the world. It just doesn't meet the challenges that we currently face with the cost of the changing climate and watching the transformation in the energy sector. The EIA has said wind, solar, and hydro now account for 18% of the energy generation in America. Solar is the fastest growing source of new energy worldwide because of its declining cost. And yet, and you've said it yourself in testimony, energy storage is the holy grail, and yet what you say, it certainly doesn't match the budget request, because developments and innovations in energy storage are absolutely crucial for modernizing our electric system. The U.S. just hit a major milestone. We now have capacity to store 1 billion watts of power for an hour. And while the U.S. is still leading in energy storage development, everyone says China is likely to pass us in the next 5 years. So it's very troubling. Your budget proposes to cut energy storage R&D by almost 75%. And let me read you directly from your budget request, so folks get a handle on this. You want to discontinue support for engagements with states, utilities, and storage providers for conducting grid-scale field tests and trials. Discontinue support for engagement with state and federal regulatory officials on efforts to understand regional market barriers to energy storage deployment. Discontinue support to states and regional entities on procurement, commissioning, and techno-economic analysis of deployed systems. Eliminate support for new collaborative testbed and field trials. Discontinue support for development of enhanced tools and data to U.S. industry for development and use of grid-scale batteries. I mean, and this goes on, but why? I mean, you talk about energy dominance, but this is like waving white flags. Why would you propose such devastating cuts for a technology that would only increase the use of clean energy, especially when our U.S. industries are in the fight of their life with China? So how do you explain that?
Ms. Castro, thank you for recognizing the great job that was done by particularly the private sector down in Puerto Rico. There were men and women who left their families for long periods of time. I was on a call yesterday with the subsector council and just said thank you as you have today. So thank you for recognizing that. Let me just briefly address your concerns here, particularly on the issue of. Again, I don't want to go back over what I talked with Mr. Rush about, but we see a lot of the dollars that had flowed into this area before, particularly on wind and solar, as areas where they are being substantially more mature. I mean, the cost of those have gone down. I think each one of them 65% at least over previous year-to-date cost. So we've seen some substantial decreases in the cost of getting those technologies to the marketplace. And I think we're going through a shifting to battery storage and beyond batteries, if you will, which is a new focus in the FY19 budget that we're going to be, and then within EERE, we're taking a holistic approach to energy storage. Early stage R&D is focused on controllable loads, on hybrid systems, new energy storage technologies. And again, this process is about, finding the right balance, and we're going to work with you to find that right balance. I not only recognize but respect your position here, and you're absolutely correct. We got a huge challenge with China, not just in this area, but in a host of other ones. Supercomputing is one of them that I will suggest to you is at the top of that list. We don't get that one right, we're in trouble.
Thank you.
Thank you. Gentleman from West Virginia, Mr. McKinley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, particularly for your interest in preventing the premature closing of our country's coal and nuclear power plants. But let me speak to a broader audience. This committee has held numerous hearings on this topic of grid reliability over the past few years. But during that time, their last 10 years, 531 coal-fired units and 11 nuclear plants have been closed. Their output has been replaced with gas plants. But unfortunately, only half of those plants have a firm supply for gas. Meaning, without a supply contract in a cold spell, gas is understandably diverted from creating electricity for home residential heating. And according to NERC, in the past 3 years, America's experienced over 4,000 forced outages of power plants across America due to a lack of fuel. 94% of those outages were gas-driven power plants. So this should not, unfortunately, these statistics don't give me the confidence that closing more coal units and nuclear power plants is a dependable option for national security. And you've been talking about national security throughout your presentation today. For example, nationally, in January, Nettle reported without the resilience of coal, the East Coast would have suffered severe electrical shortages, leading likely to widespread blackouts. And then earlier this year, ISO New England concluded the possibility that power plants won't be able to get the fuel they need to run is the foremost challenge
to a reliable power grid in New England. According to PJM, the PJM's market, it can also be shown that the demand for the grid could not have been met without coal. These are all quotes that are coming from major sources, major reliable sources. So taking these reports in consideration, can you just imagine what our grid stability was going to look like with a dependability and resilience if we have fewer coal and nuclear power plants? Mr. Secretary, you and I have had numbers of conversations about it, and this committee has been saying all along that our fuel security is a national security issue. So, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit for the record a series of documents, a letter that we have from 23 bipartisan members of Congress asking you to invoke 202C. I have another letter that's written to the President, bipartisan support for some kind of implementation to save our aging coal and nuclear power plants. And we have 4 other letters of support from labor unions across the country and interest in saving and implementing 202C. Quite frankly, Mr. Secretary, I believe it's time. You tried the 403. Some form of 202C or some other emergency act is necessary if we're going to have national security. So I'm calling on you to use whatever legal power you have so that we can meet the challenges that our manufacturers need and our communities need all across America with having a reliable grid system. So I'd like to have your thoughts. On last Thursday, I was with the President, and he specifically said, I think in a crowd in West Virginia, I think we can work something out on 202C. I know he's had conversations with you about that. Can you share to the extent of not your private conversations, where do you think we're going with 202C? Sure. Or some component of that? Thank you.
Mr. McKinley, I hope that your remarks have been televised and we can put them up because you have succinctly made the point for exactly what has to happen in this country from the standpoint of being able to protect the resiliency and the reliability of our electrical grid. And if you do not have sufficient coal and nuclear plants, the day is coming when, particularly in the northeastern part of the United States, because of other restrictions that they have on energy flowing into that part of the world, that the national security of this country is jeopardized. I don't think that's appropriate in any way. Political decisions that put people's lives in jeopardy are inappropriate. And I think this president understands that. He has had multiple conversations with me and others in his administration to find a solution to that. That's exactly what we're working on today. There are a number, as you said, 202C is one of those. There may be other options which we need to look at as well.
Are we getting close to a decision?
Expedition is of importance.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. I yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentleman from Maryland, Mr. Sarbanes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Secretary Perry, for being here. Last October, when you were here, we talked about these ongoing threats to our national security, a little bit different from what you were just speaking about, which is the national security associated with maintaining a kind of diversified portfolio of energy sources. This is more about the cyber attacks that are coming in, and we already know that there's been hacking attempts by the Russians against our elections last year. But we now know last month the Department of Homeland Security, FBI, publicly accused the Russian government cyber actors of a multi-stage intrusion campaign that's going after the energy infrastructure. And I know that you view that as intolerable, those kinds of attacks on our energy security framework, presumably.
Sir.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, sir.
And in the budget for FY 2019, there's $96 million proposed for a new office to address cyber threats coming in against the energy sector. And I appreciate that attention being given. I think we need a little bit more knowledge here in Congress to be able to respond appropriately to the proposal with respect to cybersecurity and combating these cyber threats. And last October, you may recall, I asked whether you'd be willing to come and do a briefing on that specific topic. We haven't had that yet, so I'd like to reiterate that request for a briefing. We can try to work with the committee. Obviously, Congressman Latta, McNerney, and others have a real interest in this. I'm sure the chairman does as well. So I just wanted to ask if you would be willing to work with the committee and our office to try to get that kind of a briefing together.
Yes, sir, we'll work with the committee.
Thank you very much. I want to talk now about a proposed cut in the budget. It's a 70% cut to the Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy for FY19, 2019. This program, the EERE program, as many colleagues of mine have been pointing out, has been a very smart return on investment for taxpayers, a net benefit of $230 billion when you look at what's resulted from it. I wanted to talk a little bit about what it means in my own district. One of the programs inside the EERE program or initiatives was the Sunshot Initiative, and that's been targeted for a 67% cut. This initiative was one where the Department of Energy would set a goal of capturing the potential of solar technology, which everybody acknowledges is critical, and making solar electricity more affordable by 2020. In Baltimore, we actually worked with the Department of Energy to bring that potential to low-income homeowners so that all communities would be able to take advantage of low-cost solar and energy. So it's meant a great deal to Baltimore. Over the last few years, we've been able to put in 53 rooftop solar installations for low-income homeowners. There's 990 additional ones planned over the next 2 years. And with DOE's continued support, the Baltimore Shines model, which is our local sort of version of the Sunshot Initiative, if you will, this can really be a model across the country, and we think can lead in terms of what it means to have diversified financing for low-income solar installation. So the basic question here is, does your department remain committed to the goals of the Sunshot Initiative, which seems to be like the terminology of it or the name of it's being pushed aside? It's hard to keep track of where your commitment is and the department's commitment is to this solar technology advancement is, and will you maintain the same commitment within the Solar Energy Technologies Office that has been a hallmark up to this point, and further commit to making sure that low-income communities are in a position to take advantage of these low-cost energy and skilled job opportunities which are available within the solar technology industry?
Yes, sir. Mr. Sarbanes, let me work with you. I'm not that knowledgeable of that specific program from a granular standpoint, and I want to be able to give you an appropriate answer. And so I will follow up.
I appreciate that. I think if you look inside the department's data on this, it's quite impressive, and we can help present some of that back to you as well.
Yes, sir.
Thank you.
Mr. Kinzinger.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. If I get Mr. Flores' attention for a second. Yeah, there you go. Thanks. I needed to. Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. As you may or may not know, I have 4 nuclear power plants in my district, which is the most of any in the country. It's 8 reactors. Obviously, that's many locations for spent fuel storage. And so nuclear is extremely important, not just for our domestic energy production, but one of the things, last time you were here, you and I talked a little about, was energy as a tool of national security and the importance of that and the role that that plays. Just this week, you made the point that every molecule of American gas that goes into Europe is a molecule that they don't have to get from Russia and be held hostage. I know you're aware that Russia's building or considering about 55 nuclear projects around the globe, and for China, that number is closer to 200 projects. Does your sentiment about Russian natural gas apply to nuclear power as well, sir?
Yes, sir, it does, and I think it goes right to the heart of the agreement with Saudi Arabia that's being negotiated now, the 123 agreement, in the standpoint of if we do not succeed in that effort, the alternatives are China or Russia. Number one, neither of those countries care about nonproliferation, and the other one is we will lose the opportunity to develop our supply chain and our intellectual chain that will further put America at a disadvantage, and not just in the civil nuclear side, but sometime down the road on our ability to protect this country from a weapons standpoint. So this is a critical time in American history relative to supporting nuclear energy, civil nuclear energy.
Thank you. And I appreciate that your budget request prioritizes nuclear energy research, nuclear security, and of course Yucca Mountain. However, I remain deeply concerned about the state of our domestic nuclear industry, as we've talked about. I've introduced legislation with my friend Mr. Doyle to make common sense reforms at the NRC to provide existing plants some relief, but without a strong domestic industry, how do we expect American technology and, more importantly, safety culture and non-proliferation standards to compete with state-run power companies like Russia and China? So overall, what's the DOE currently doing or planning to do to support our domestic industry and reaffirm our global leadership?
Sure. Well, obviously, the administration the message is clear, not just on the nuclear side, but coal as well. And it's not just those two. This administration is committed to a broad portfolio of renewables, of gas, of hydro, coal, and nuclear.
Okay. And while I believe that H.R. 1320 is part of the solution, there are several options to put the domestic nuclear industry on steadier ground and to increase our global competitiveness. Can you elaborate as much as you can on DOE's light water reactor sustainability program, which is looking at extending existing licenses from 60 to 80 years?
Yes, sir. We'll continue to promote those technologies as best we can. We think that, again, this plays into the diverse portfolio and new technologies, whether it's clean coal technologies, whether it's, I was on the West Coast at Livermore Lab 2 weeks ago looking at technologies that are making our wind turbines more efficient. So there's a host, innovation rather than regulation is the real motto here from our perspective. And whether it's in the nuclear side of things, whether it's in the fossil fuels, whether it's in the renewables, the national labs and the dollars that you all are authorizing for these national labs will go a long way towards making America more competitive in the global energy marketplace.
Thank you. And lastly, do you believe that wholesale energy markets can do a better job at valuing the unique resource attributes of nuclear power? And if so, how can DOE and Congress help to reform these energy markets? What role can we play in doing so?
Well, I think one of the roles that DOE needs to play in this is to rebalance. That obviously, previous to this administration coming into place, there were some thumbs on the market. And at least we should take that pressure off of the direction that those markets were headed. Obviously, there were some political considerations in the previous administration that they were not fond of coal, they were not fond of nuclear, and both of those industries paid a price for it. They had their favorites in the arena, and they supported those. What we're looking at is to rebalance, if you will, to take the thumb off of the market scale. But with that in mind, the more important issue is one of national security, of being able to know without a doubt that the energy supply will be there when we need it, whether it's from a cyber attack that stops the transmission of gas somewhere, whether it is a hurricane that hits God forbid, not again, the northeastern part of this country. the national security side of this is even more important than the economic side of it.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate you being here, and I yield back.
Time's expired. Mr. Tonko for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Welcome, Secretary Perry, and thank you for returning before the committee. Over the past year, I haven't agreed with all of your decisions or priorities. I thought the notice of proposed rulemaking was incredibly misguided, but overall, and it might surprise you to hear me say this, I think you've done a fine job as Secretary. As far as I'm aware, there have been no major scandals or extravagant waste of taxpayer dollars. You have visited many national labs, and it seems like you believe in the mission of the agency, all of which is more than I can say for some of your cabinet counterparts. With that said, I'm concerned by a number of the proposed cuts in FY19's requests. Many have been mentioned already: EERE, the Office of Science, grid modernization programs, and the elimination of ARPA-E. In the past, you have stated support for ARPA-E and DOE's innovation budget. Last year, you testified that energy innovation is a part of DOE's core mission. And I think you might agree that cuts of the magnitude that have been proposed are not good for the future of America's global energy leadership. So I would encourage you to push back on OMB to ensure innovation continues to be a top priority of the agency. Specifically, now that Congress has appropriated FY18 funding for programs that the previous request proposed eliminating, I expect we won't see a repeat of last year's impoundment of ARPA-E funds or a delay of weatherization funding to states, which they are expecting on July 1. But I want to focus on a different issue. Mr. Secretary, are you familiar with this recent National Energy Technology Laboratory report entitled Reliability, Resilience, and the Oncoming Wave of Retiring Baseload Units? It is dated March 13th, 2018, and was posted on DOE's website on March 27th.
I'm not an expert at it, but I'm certainly familiar with it.
Okay. Are you aware of any DOE political officials that discussed this report as it was being developed by NETL?
I'm not.
Would you be willing to share any communications between DOE officials and NETL about the report with the committee?
I'd be happy to.
Thank you. The reason I ask is because this report is cited numerous times in First Energy's Section 202C request, which was submitted just 2 days after the report was published on DOE's website. I want to take issue with how the report represents the data to conclude coal made the grid more resilient during the bomb cyclone. I think most economists and grid operators agree on what happened. There was greater electricity demand, prices increased, and that allowed marginal power generators to come online. In PJM, those are coal plants that under normal circumstances are not economically competitive. We saw electricity markets at work. When demand increased, more expensive generators could operate. This is evidence of coal's cost, not its resilience. In fact, according to PJM, at times, coal plants experienced higher failure rates than other resources. This notion that the only thing standing between us and blackouts is aging coal plants is just not accurate. What we might agree about, but I suspect for different reasons, is the premature closure of a significant amount of clean energy resources would be bad for air pollution, as well as our short and long-term emissions reduction goals. If that's the case, we should look to what has been done by states such as my home state of New York, to preserve and compensate zero emissions generation. Or if you prefer an in-market solution, consider what New York's ISO is working on to develop to price carbon within the market. These options are not without their flaws or opponents, but they do represent a serious path forward to address some of the issues you have been discussing this past year. But ultimately, these are policy decisions for states or for Congress, acting under the pretense of an emergency to justify unilateral agency action is not good for consumers or the people responsible for operating our grid. So, Secretary Perry, do you have any thoughts on the role or appropriateness of states taking action to support zero-emission generators through clean energy standards or similar programs?
No, sir. I'm encourage states to get involved with making their states more competitive. I certainly did that when I was the governor of Texas. and we saw a reduction of almost 20% of total carbon footprint, over 60% of both NOx and SOx during that period of time. So the point is, states can have a real role in this. With that said, from my perspective, this issue that we're facing, and I recognize, and by the way, thank you for your kind remarks. My wife doesn't even agree with me all the time, so.
Okay, well,
Yes, sir.
I need to meet her then.
Yes, sir. I'm gonna show her this if you don't mind. But the point is that there are real national security implications here. And I'll finish with this. As the governor of Texas, I brought in ERCOT, which is our big electrical reliability council that oversees our generation in Texas. And I think it was late spring of one year, we'd had a very hot summer, which we typically do in Texas, and we'd had some brownouts. We were trying to manage this system. And I shared with him, I said, listen, you're the expert here, but I don't want to get a phone call from citizens of this state because you weren't prepared and you didn't put in place the needed generation capacity to be able to deliver electricity to a city like Dallas that's had 15 straight days of 105+ degree temperature and a grandmother's died. I said, that is not a conversation that I'm going to accept. And the same is true as the Secretary of Energy and the administration's focus on making sure that we have the resiliency and the reliability of our grid. And I want to work with you. I'll work with the states as well to find the solutions to this. But I don't think we have time to be studying this anymore to the standpoint of, oh, let's just kick the can down the road. I think we are facing, with these plants being scheduled, some of them prematurely to come offline. I just don't want a call from somebody in upstate New York because the power's gone out because we didn't have the political courage to put into place a strategy that made sure that a citizen of New York is never going to have to make the decision of whether or not we're going to turn the lights on or we're going to keep our family warm.
I've exhausted my time. I would just say that New York did make certain that they had their power supplies met and with zero emissions being the guiding force. So I think that's the difference here. But I yield back, Mr. Chair.
Time's expired. Mr. Griffith, 5 minutes for questions, please, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate you being here. All my questions have gone out the window because of comments that have been made of recent, or at least a lot of them have. You were very kind to the previous administration to say they put their thumbs on the scale when they were looking at various energy sources. In my district, which has got natural gas and predominantly coal, we felt like it wasn't a thumb on the scale. We felt like it was a boot on our necks. We had thousands of jobs lost, families disrupted, communities losing businesses left and right, hospitals closing down because they no longer had the big employer at the coal mine to pump in the insurance into the hospital and the money coming in there. It was devastating. And so I was kind of surprised, one, that Mr. McKinley missed the Nettle report in his detail. He kept going. I guess he had to have some time for questions, and so he left that one out. But further, that Mr. Tonko doesn't understand, and he's a good man, but he doesn't understand it would be easy for people who were that desperate, like a thirsty man in the desert who finally discovers an oasis, to consume that Nettle report and put out the request for a 202C relief within 2 days because the coal community has been desperate until you all have come along and not wanting to put your finger on the scale at all, but wanting to make sure that there's an all-of-the-above strategy for the United States. And I thank you. Would you like to make any comment before I go on?
Go right ahead, sir.
All right. So I appreciate that. And I do have this to say, although it's not your department. He indicated that, you know, the fact that we had to use the coal and it cost more, that was the markets at work. It's also federal regulation, because what we need to do is we need to look at the new source review rules, because when a coal-fired power plant and lots of other businesses that use coal for power go in and they want to make one little change, even if it makes that plant more efficient, they have to then comply with all kinds of regulations. I have a facility in my district, which is not a power plant, another facility that I toured a number of years ago, and they had a kink in their conveyor belt because at one time there had been a part of their paint shop on the end of the conveyor belt. They no longer had that paint shop there, or that painting capacity, I think it was lacquer. But they left the kink, and so we walked over the conveyor belt once, and then we walked over it a second time where it just went out into empty space. And the owner said that because he had to meet those EPA regulations, it was easier just to leave the kink in the conveyor belt than to make his process more efficient. We need to make some changes there, and I hope you would agree with that, even though I know it's the EPA's turf.
Right. Mr. Griffith, I think you bring in a very high-level way what this administration is focused on. The President has given clear directives to people like myself, Scott Pruitt, Secretary Zinke, from a regulatory standpoint, that getting rid of regulations that where the cost outweigh the benefit is one of the real goals, and it's been, I think, very successful to date. And the key here is having some common sense applied, being able to recognize that we have overregulated this country, and those overregulations have cost this country a huge amount of jobs and untold wealth. So you are spot on from the standpoint of the single most important thing I learned as a governor. The tax policy is important. I mean, don't overtax, but businesses know how to deal with that. It's when you have a regulatory environment that is strangling, where you will lose your businesses. One of the reasons we were able to bring a lot of businesses out of California to Texas. No offense to anybody from California that's here, but the point is they were over-regulating, and businesses want to get out of that environment. So the regulation side of what you're talking about is incredibly important. It's not just about being able to address the national security side of things, the issues that we talk about, whether it's a 202 or whether it's some other avenue towards making sure we have a reliable portfolio. But the regulatory environment in this country has to be addressed.
And I could not agree more, and I appreciate all the work that you all are doing in the administration to get this straightened out, because it really has, I think, hurt our country. That being said, let me switch to more positive things. Ms. Castor complimented you on the testimony of one of your folks at the O&I subcommittee yesterday related to Puerto Rico. I think that they're doing great work down there. We appreciate it. But I think we can also use that as a test bed for other areas that might get isolated in a disaster, and look at doing microgrids and other things that we can move this country forward to make sure that we have our grid resilient. We have a perfect example. We're going to spend a lot of money there anyway. Let's spend it doing experiments to see how we can build the system for the rest of the country as well. And with that, I know you agree, but I have to yield back.
Yes, sir.
Time expired. Mr. Loebsack, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Great to see you again, Mr. Secretary. We don't have a lot in common, Iowa and Texas, but we do have wind energy in common.
I spent a lot of time in your home state, sir.
I'm aware of that, too. That's right. Seems like ages ago, but I'm aware of that. Thank you. But I am happy about your support for wind energy. As you know, that constitutes about 38% of the electricity generated in the state of Iowa. So it's really a great program. And thank you for coming back to this committee. I do appreciate the accountability that you demonstrate here. I think all of us do on a bipartisan basis. As you know, of course, my home state of Iowa does lead the nation in biofuels production. It's an integral part of our economy, of the farm economy, and right now the farm economy is suffering. We've got concerns about trade issues too. We don't need to get into that today, but that's certainly a bipartisan concern that we have in the state of Iowa, what's happening on that front. And I'm sure that you're aware of the recent press reports about the waivers that the EPA has granted to small refineries to release them from their obligations under the Renewable Fuel Standard Program, including actually some of the nation's largest and most profitable refiners. And as you can imagine, the biofuels community has significant concerns about the apparent increase in the awarding of these waivers by the EPA, and about the implications for the biofuels industry, the corn market, and of course the farmers who depend upon the market, the workers in the industry, all the John Deere and a lot of other, the implement companies that are all related to this as well economically. And the small refinery waiver process, as you know, requires the EPA to consult with the DOE and with you, the Secretary of Energy in particular, in review of the exemption petitions. And unfortunately, there's not a lot of transparency, if any, in this process. So I do want to ask you, Has the EPA consulted with the DOE on their issuance of these waivers as required by law?
Yes, sir. I would suggest to you they have. I don't know the intensity, and that may be the wrong word, but the depth of those negotiations and what have you. I know that they use us as the agency to advise them about how this would impact the energy sector. So, for clarity purposes, EPA is who hands out those.
Right, but they are required by law to consult with DOE and with
but they do
Secretary of
consult with us,
Energy,
yes, sir.
right? Did your office recommend that EPA adopt any small refinery waivers this year? And if so, what waivers did you recommend?
Let me go back and get the details of that for you so that I can give you specific and correct information, Mr.
Yeah, and I really do appreciate that, because what I'm going to ask you then, moving forward, just yesterday, your counterpart at the USDA, Secretary Sonny Perdue, indicated that he believes the EPA is misusing the hardship waivers. And as you know, our governor is in town today, too, and she's trying to get through to the president to talk to him about the RFS. Do you agree with Secretary Perdue that the EPA has misused the hardship waivers?
I can't speak to that because I don't know the details of the issue. If I could just add one side of the story. One of the things that we're working on is to find some other, I mean, number one, I know my Iowa corn farmers pretty well, and they really don't care where this ethanol goes as long as it gets to go somewhere.
Right. I just had a meeting with a number of them
Yes,
last
sir.
weekend. They're
And
concerned
I
about it.
respect that, having been a former agriculture commissioner of the state of Texas. We're in conversations with my counterpart in Mexico, and we were talking to him as late as this last month about being able to move U.S. ethanol to Mexico into their fuel mix, because they're in the process of we understand that they're going to be mandating some ethanol.
And I really appreciate that. And we have to keep in mind, too, that we're talking about a lot of production of corn here in the country and, of course, around the world. And ethanol is obviously one use of that corn. There's no question, but we have to make sure in those NAFTA renegotiations that we don't get our corn market in Mexico cut off as well. So I just have some questions. I don't have time to go through them here, but I do want to submit these questions for the record, having to do with the total number of refinery waiver applications that the DOE evaluated for the last 5 years. So a number of those, and I would like to submit those for the record, Mr. Chair.
Have them ready for you.
And thanks for your time today. I
sir.
appreciate it. We look forward to your answers
Yes,
to the
sir.
questions. Thanks, Mr. Secretary. Appreciate it.
Thank
Now you
you.
go back.
Mr. Johnson, 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, good to see you again.
Thank you, sir.
Sure enjoyed our trip down to Piketon
Yes, sir.
a few months ago. You know, you and I had extensive discussions when we were there, and like you, I support an all of the above energy policy, and I know you believe that as well. My district in eastern and southeastern Ohio, and you and I talked about that a little bit as well, is no stranger to the benefits of a diverse generation with our abundance of both coal and natural gas. Many of the coal plants in the 6th District of Ohio along the Ohio River are not only a reliable source of power, but they are the strong economic drivers for the communities in which they exist. The people rely on them there for good-paying jobs. So I worry about the recent retirements and announced retirements of coal plants, especially as federal and state laws and regulations have played a major role in affecting these plants over the years. I know you have repeatedly expressed similar concerns and have pushed FERC on these issues. So my first question, are you satisfied with FERC's work to date on this issue? And do you believe FERC and the RTOs and the ISOs are taking the right approach to these issues?
Well, relative to the 403 that we sent up, I would have to be on the opposing side of, I wouldn't have sent them our recommendations if we didn't think they were correct. You know, I'm not going to, that's the only dealings that I've had with them
Sure.
to date. So my first experience of picking up that potato was it was pretty hot.
Yeah, yeah. Well, second question, you state that the FY19 DOE budget will help improve grid resilience and support generation diversity. Can you provide examples on how DOE will work toward these objectives?
Well, obviously having grid diversity has to do with having resource diversity. One of our challenges is that in the course of the last decade, the resources have changed drastically. You think back to 2005, just as Hurricane Katrina was coming into the Gulf Coast, there was a fellow giving a speech about peak oil. Fast forward 10 years, and the United States is in the process of becoming the #1 oil and gas producing country in the world. I mean, that literally happened in a decade. The explosion of renewables and the grid being able to manage all of that. And so the technology to manage the grid, and I put that into the resiliency side and the reliability side. So the challenges that are out in the world today and how quickly they came is a great testament to our national labs and the innovation that comes out of those national labs and our private sector working together in many cases. So the way we look at this is we've been blessed with a lot of resources. How you manage those resources, both with innovation and with common sense. Common sense part of this, from my perspective, is don't restrict resources getting into your grid that could put your national security in jeopardy, for instance. So all of this is it's quite a challenge, Mr. Johnson, as you know. And but I'm quite confident we're up to it, and we'll find the solutions that challenge us as a country.
Yeah, well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. You know, shifting gears just a little bit, when we were at Piketon, you and I appreciate your support of all the stuff that's going on down at Piketon as well. I appreciate that very much. You've made reference to an Appalachian plan which relates to infrastructure to take advantage of our natural gas resources and other industrial resources in West Virginia and Ohio. Can you elaborate quickly what that vision looks like?
Yes, sir. As the governor of Texas, I used to fret greatly in August and September about a Category 5 hurricane coming up the Houston Ship Channel, Mr. Olson, and creating havoc in the petrochemical footprint in the state of Texas, which would have negative effect all over this country. Having a duplication of that somewhere made a lot of sense to me. And why not put it where the resource is, which is in the Appalachian region? You're sitting on top of the Marcellus, the Utica. So if government will not be an impediment from a regulatory standpoint in particular, the private sector will come and fund that. This isn't a matter of, you know, coming to Congress and saying, hey, will you put billions of dollars into this? Just don't get in the way.
There you go.
And help those states, West Virginia, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Kentucky, put that plan together. We're in the, I'm not going to say nascent, but we're in the early stages of conversation, coordinating with those states, coordinating with other agencies to be able to lay out a plan, hopefully before this year's out, so that there's a clear opportunity for this country to have a duplication of that petrochemical footprint in the Gulf Coast of Texas in the Appalachian region. Sure. The economic impact would be stunning. More importantly, the national security side of it would be far-reaching.
Makes perfect sense. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Gentleman is back. Mr. Schrader, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being here. It's nice to have a normal and competent member of the administration before the committee here. I would like to go back to Chairman Walden's comments regarding the power marketing administrations. As you might imagine, that's a bipartisan issue in my part of the country. Page 14 of your testimony, you state, Budget proposes the sale of transmission assets to the Western Area Power Administration, Bonneville Power Administration, and Southwestern Power Administration, and to reform the laws governing how the PMAs establish power rates, et cetera. And frankly, as a member of Congress from the Pacific Northwest, very concerned about the administration's continued insistence we sell off transmission assets to the Bonneville Power Administration and require them to sell power at market rates. Mr. Chairman, I guess I'd like to enter into record the bipartisan letter the Pacific Northwest delegation sent to OMB Director Mr. Mulvaney opposing this proposal in the 2019 budget.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. BPA is a nonprofit federal wholesale utility and power marketer that receives no congressional appropriations. I repeat that, no congressional appropriations, and must recover its costs with revenues it earns, like the private sector, from selling wholesale power and transmission services. BPA provides approximately half the electricity used in the Pacific Northwest and operates 3/4 of the region's high-voltage transmission grid. Selling off these transmission assets would fragment the grid, be devastating to the region, and provide a meager one-time asset that would not have any long-term beneficial effects with regard to our economy. Requiring BPA to sell power at market rates would essentially be the death knell of BPA. BPA serves the public interest and has other obligations. And as such, BPA markets its power at cost. Historically, it's provided some of the lowest cost electricity in the nation, natural gas having put some pressure on it, obviously, at this point. And that, coupled with BPA's increased court-mandated spill and fish recovery operations, which account now for 1/3 of the rates that Pacific Northwest folks pay, and the Treasury consequently does not have to pay, has put additional cost pressures on the agency and driven their costs up some. Requiring BPA to sell its power at market rates would drive them into the red, make them unable to meet their obligations to the Treasury, actually costing taxpayer money, strand the federal government with a very expensive, non-functioning asset, and put federal taxpayers on the hook for the fish mitigation costs, which come to the tune of almost $1 billion, I think a little over $1 billion a year. There's been overwhelming bipartisan, bicameral opposition, as the chairman of the full committee testified to, opposition to the administration's proposal. 8 members of this committee, including my fellow Northwest colleagues, Ms. McMorris Rodgers and Chairman Walden, sent a letter to our budget committee this year that I referenced, asking them to reject the proposal. Yet once again, it seems like we're here. So our region already produces some of the cleanest power that we've talked about, very affordable. We repay the Treasury with interest. So if you can explain to me what problem the administration's actually trying to solve with this proposal.
Ms. Schrader, let me just remark that maybe it's my best addition here would be, I'm reminded of a Kenny Rogers song where he talked about you need to know when to hold them and know when to fold them.
Understand and appreciate that response and appreciate your
Congress has been very clear about this issue. I will be more than happy to carry the message back.
Thank you very much, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here.
Yes, sir.
Gentleman is back. Dr. Bouchon, 5 minutes of questions.
Welcome, Secretary Perry.
Yes, sir.
From Southwest Indiana. This committee has spent most of this Congress examining the country's electrical grid, and throughout our hearings, experts have stressed to us the importance of a reliable and resilient electrical grid. There are many sources of energy that can power the grid. However, coal-fired electricity is one of the most reliable, fuel-secure, and affordable energy sources. This was evident during the 2014 polar vortex and again most recently with the bomb cyclone. It was the reliable baseload power plants such as coal and nuclear that prevented blackouts in many regions of the country. Even with its reliability, coal-fired power plants continue to retire at alarming numbers, and I know Mr. Johnson just mentioned this. Since 2010, more than 1/3 of the nation's coal-fired power plants have shut down or announced plans to close. That's the equivalent of shutting down the entire electricity supply for Indiana, Ohio, Illinois, and Kentucky. 39 coal power generating units have been forced to close in my home state of Indiana alone. The 8th District of Indiana, which I represent, is home to all the coal mines in the state of Indiana, which is responsible for more than 70% of the state's energy. Without traditional baseload energy sources such as coal being properly valued in wholesale markets, plants continue to be at risk of retiring, leaving many of my constituents at risk of losing their jobs, seeing higher electrical bills, and providing less reliable energy to power our homes. This is why I've introduced H.R. 5270, the Electricity Reliability and Fuel Security Act, which would create a temporary tax credit covering a small portion of the cost to operate and maintain existing coal-fired power plants. I believe the temporary tax credit, which would last for 5 years, is necessary to avoid more coal retirements while Congress, the administration, and grid operators work together to ensure the grid remains reliable and resilient. Secretary Perry, do you think that you would be supportive of this legislation and the other efforts that Congress, DOE, FERC, and the grid operators are taking to properly value coal to prevent more power plant retirements and provide our nation with a more reliable and secure grid?
Yes, sir. Mr. Bouchon, I think it's important that we put into place some processes that assure this country has a reliable and a resilient grid. Coal's going to be a part of that. And coal's going to be a part of the future energy supply for the world. By 2040, the estimate is that 77% of the energy produced in the world will still be fossil fuels. Coal will be playing a major part of that. Our goal and our part to play in this is that U.S. coal is, coal exports are up 61% from a year ago. We're going to continue. When I go to India, we're not just going to be talking about LNG. We're going to be talking about coal and clean coal technology that's developed in this country. We want them, they're going to burn coal, and we want them to use our technology to be able to remove the emissions that are harming the environment in that part of the world and globally as well. So any reasonable approach to making sure that we have a reliable energy source in this country, we're going to be working with, and we certainly think your legislation is reasonable and heads in that direction.
Thank you very much for being here, Secretary. Thanks for your work. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
With respect, the chair now calls upon the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Flores, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Secretary, I think you and I are equally supportive of LNG, and we recognize the incredible importance of LNG exports, not only in terms of our balance of trade, economic opportunity, but also geopolitical position that it places us in vis-a-vis some of the threats that we face around the world. I know that you've taken some good steps to improve DOE's permitting process when it comes to LNG, to clear the backlog of the applications that were pending that you inherited from the last administration. But I also understand that FERC is understaffed and that they are overwhelmed with their own backlog. Is there anything that you, as a Secretary of DOE, can do to help FERC with their backlog?
I'd be more than happy to have this conversation with the chairman and
okay.
We're more than happy to assist them any way that we can.
Okay. It was my understanding you might be in a position to move some folks from Sandia temporarily to FERC to help with that. Anyway, if you can answer that supplementally for us, that would be great. So now that with LNG out of the way, the next area that I'm particularly focused on today is nuclear, particularly advanced nuclear technologies. The alma mater that you and I share, which I am pleased to represent, is a partner on some of DOE's university engineering university programs. I understand that the administration is conducting a wide-ranging review of nuclear policy, but while we await the outcome of that broader review, what are the most important policies that Congress can advance now in the short term, in the near term?
I'm sorry.
What are the most important policies that Congress can advance in the near term while we wait for the administration to finish its overall nuclear review policy?
Well, certainly I think that making sure that the resources are appropriate on this the National Nuclear Policy Review. And we have, for too long, I guess, Mr. Flores, this country has kind of put nuclear, our arsenal on the back burner, if you will.
Right.
I think the mid-'90s and the peace dividend and the world was going to live happily ever after, and that's not the case. And,
Right.
and we came to our senses, if you will, or the world became a little clearer in view, and we saw that maybe we need to make sure that we have a nuclear arsenal that is modern. These things, they age just like any other infrastructure, and being able to modernize it, being able to look at new systems, whether it's delivery or whether it's the actual arsenal itself, is very much an important role that you in Congress are going to play, from the being able to fund it, for one thing.
Sure.
We have a new administrator of the NNSA, a very capable individual who I think you'll find very good to work with, very knowledgeable, and a good partner in this.
When we look at the nuclear technologies of the future, advanced nuclear reactors and small modular reactors, anytime you have a first mover technology like that, there are some challenges in terms of trying to help that our nuclear innovators face in terms of trying to get them off the ground so that they can move forward and get it into a position to be a commercially viable power generation source. I would ask you if you would have your staff work with us so we can try to figure out what those challenges are and what Congress can do to develop the statutory framework to be able to address those challenges.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
We think SMRs are incredibly important going into the future, and the application that they can play, particularly for our national security. If the concern is about keeping these devices secure,
Right.
obviously being on a United States military base is as secure a site as you can have. So, SMRs are going to play a very, very important role in the diversity of our portfolio, energy production-wise, going forward.
Okay. Well, thank you, Mr. Secretary. I've reached the end of my time. I do have additional questions that we'll submit supplementally, and I look forward
Yes,
to
sir.
working with you as we address our nation's energy policy. I yield back.
Time's expired. Mr. Kramer, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Secretary, for being with us again. Thank you for your excellent leadership at a very important agency. Before I drill down into what's most important to me today, specifically the fossil energy research and development budget, I want to associate myself with Mr. Peters' comments about ITER. Even though San Diego is a long ways from North Dakota, his point about leveraging that resource, I think, was made well. And I also want to associate myself with the fact that I do feel like there's greater confidence given recent changes in leadership, and appreciate your attention to that and your vast knowledge of it, so thank you for that. With that, I do want to get to the more concerning topic for me, and that is the administration seems to be sort of sliding away from a commitment to at least, if not pilot scale, commercialization gap with demonstration projects in the fossil energy R&D, particularly as it relates to where I think the focus ought to be, and that is carbon capture and utilization and storage of CO2 from coal-fired power plants. Now, we know and we appreciate in North Dakota your role, your agency's role in partnering with the Energy and Environmental Research Center at the University of North Dakota and some of our utilities, particularly Minkota Power, in looking for some opportunity, testing some opportunity for an alum cycle or and some of these new technologies that will bridge coal's past and coal's future as a clean resource. But without the gap being filled, or at least supplemented by the taxpayers, I don't know that we can get there, quite honestly, and yet we need it so badly. Specifically, the administration's fiscal year 19 budget proposal moves away from the research and development of carbon capture in reducing its R&D roughly 75% relative to fiscal year 18. And of course, both in 17 and 18, the Congress itself has had to sort of step it up. So given the fossil energy R&D request as a whole was increased relative to the President's request in fiscal year 18, can you explain why the department shifted so dramatically from carbon capture R&D?
Yes, sir. Here's my observation is that the FY19 budget will not impact the current activities that the department has funded up in your part of the world. Plains CO2 reduction, regional carbon sequestration partnership, that's going to continue on. Feasibility study on the Tundra project, that one is in that funding stream for FY19. The carbon SAFE, SAFE activities, those are funded as well. Additionally, on the carbon capture issue, last year in about May, I was in China for the Clean Energy Ministerial, and we were able to get CCUS placed into that. Now, obviously, these are not dollars that are going to be spent in North Dakota, and I understand that, but I think from the standpoint of the commitment of the agency to the carbon capture, utilization, sequestration, and actually yesterday, Chairman Alexander in the Senate was talking about being able to find, obviously using our national labs, using our universities that we have relationships with, a use for carbon dioxide is that, and again, there's no eureka moment here, but those are the exciting technologies and opportunities that we think are out there in the future that we're going to be looking at funding. And I hope you know that our commitment is very strong to that. Senator Hoeven, my former governor colleague, he and I talked at some length yesterday about the opportunities that we can work on together with North Dakota and DOE.
In my remaining seconds, let me first of all strongly encourage you and invite you to North Dakota as it now warms up and thaws out to come in and see the work at the University of North Dakota. Secondly, I want to ask for your assistance in advocating with us for a 45Q, the 45Q tax credit, which was slightly, improved in the most recent bill, but not very useful until we reconcile IRS and EPA rules so that it's more useful for these types of projects. It's essential. And then there's another credit, the refined coal credit, that I think just has to be extended so we can build this bridge again between basic research and commercialization. We're at the cusp, and we run the risk of losing all those opportunities. As you said, innovation, not regulation, is our motto. I like it. Let's live with it. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Inspired, Mr. Green from Texas. 5 minutes for questions. Are you ready, Mr. Green?
Yes, Mr. Chairman. I want to welcome the Secretary. My other job is I'm a ranking member on the Health Subcommittee, and we just finished a hearing upstairs, Mr. Secretary, and you and I have known each other since we could actually play basketball in the state capitol. I want to thank Chairman Upton and Ranking Member Rush for having this hearing today, and Secretary Perry for taking the time to testify with us. DOE has many important missions, and ensuring adequate funding for the agency is essential. The President's budget, FY19, is a 3.8 cut from the FY18 enacted level. Much of these cuts hit clean energy programs, grid operations, and next-generation energy technologies. I'm concerned that these cuts in these programs could have grave consequences to the environment at a time when many nuclear plants are going offline. Currently, there are 4 planned deactivations of nuclear plants in Ohio and Pennsylvania, which generate 40 million megawatts of electricity. In PJM, more than all the power from wind and solar combined in PJM. First Energy Corporation recently filed a 202 request stating that immediate aid was needed for all coal and nuclear plants within PJM, not just their own. I've worked with many of my colleagues on this committee over the decades to updates to the Federal Power Act throughout the years, including changes to the Section 202C. The current request concerns me in many ways. Section 202 has been used in past for immediate crisis, from the California energy crisis in 2000 to the East Coast blackouts in 2003. The mechanism has historically been used on a short-term basis. At a Bloomberg event recently, when asked to define an emergency, you responded that you flip the light switch on and nothing happens. I agree with that characterization. Can you elaborate on that quote and what is in your mind and constitutes an emergency that justifies the use of 202C?
Yes, sir. I think the observation is a very simplistic one that I use, but I think it cut right to the core of when you have a use for your energy, whether it be at a Wall Street financial institution, whether it be at the Federal Reserve and the computers that are there, or whether it's on a military base to secure this country's liberties and freedoms, or if it's in your home and you have an all-electric home and it is a chill factor of -20 in the Northeast somewhere, and you call for that power and it's not there, that is an emergency. And that's exactly the point that I was trying to make in a very simplistic approach, but I think it did make the point that if you don't have this electricity, you don't have this reliable source, then we've got a real challenge and a real problem in this country, and that's the reliability and the resiliency issue of this grid. And being able to guarantee to the American people that that will be there is one of our roles, you as a United States Congressman, me as the Secretary of Energy. So from my perspective, having a diverse portfolio, it's one of the things that we did in your home state over the course of particularly in the 2000s when they deregulated the energy market and we had this diverse, we developed more wind energy than any other state in the nation, the gas that came online, the other incentives that the state, and I think Mr. Tonko was talking about giving states some of this responsibility, and I totally agree with that. But my point is the time for study is over. From my perspective, we've got to act on this because I don't want to wake up next winter with a polar vortex that is bigger than the one that we had before, and having taken some nuclear plants and some coal plants offline and not having that resource, not having that energy available to protect the citizens' safety and or their security.
Can you elaborate on the potential tools at DOE you can feel could be better suited to securing a valuable emissions-free nuclear plants, for example?
Yes, sir. Well, this one's going to be a bit of a bank shot, but I think it makes the point, Gene, that we're in the process of previous administrations, not just the last administration, but you go all the way back probably 20, 25 years. Previous administrations have not put into place, didn't respect the nuclear power industry. I think they overregulated them. They put a lot of cost on them through regulations. The last administration took away our ability to process high-assay uranium for purposes of civil nuclear. That was started by the administration before the Obama administration, but they shut that down. And then the private sector has no place for that fuel. My point with all of this is we are at a critical place here today that if we don't send some messages, whether it's making a good agreement with the Saudi Arabians to
to help them develop their civil nuclear programs so that American contractors are going to have the supply chain to do that, that our universities don't have the incentives to put young men and women into the nuclear engineering field. All of that's going to come to a head, and we're going to be at a critical position, and I think it's sooner than we realize. And if we don't have a civil nuclear program that is robust, it will soon have an impact on our ability to keep our weapons programs up to place, because we won't have the intellectual capability coming up through our national labs to do this. I mean, I just think this is, you bring up an incredibly important issue, Mr. Green.
Well, reliability is really important, like you said, when you turn on the light switch and they can't, or the air conditioner or the heater. Most of our problems in Texas, when it gets real warm in the summer, in fact, we were jokingly yesterday, without air conditioning there would not, and elevators, there would not be a Houston, Texas, because of the heat from literally 1st of May to the end of September. While I disagree with the recent notice of public review directed to FERC in the Section 202 filing, I do think it's important we look at planned retirements across the country. While not rising to the level of immediate emergency, this is an issue both DOE and Congress should address putting forward. Obviously, in Texas, we have 2 nuclear power plants. Now we have an abundance of natural gas, and of course, producing more wind power that was created during your administration and your governor than any other state in the union. So, and hopefully we'll do some solar, but in the Northeast, they don't have the ability to that, oftentimes with the wind or solar. So it's basically older production, whether it be coal or nuclear power, and that's why we need to see how we can do it, because those folks, we don't want those folks freezing in the dark. And, but anyway, I want to follow what the Department of Energy does, and hopefully our committee will work with you on making sure that reliability is important, but we also need to see as best we can how we get it done. Yes, sir. So,
My friend's time is expired. I'll call upon the gentleman from Oklahoma for 5 minutes for questions.
And Texans do stick together. No, I'm kidding. Anyways, hey, thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Mr. Chairman, Oklahoma also steals football players from A&M and University of Texas and my alma mater, University of Houston.
No, we don't steal, we recruit better. I mean, obviously, they want to go to, a climate that they can live in. Anyways, hey, thank you. And Secretary Perry, I want to remind you of a time you met my son in Leader McCarthy's office. My boy wasn't very big at the time, and he was talking to you. He was kind of like most little boys, was looking around, and you grabbed him by the shoulders, and you set him on the chair, and he said, "Young man, look at me in the eyes when you talk to me." And I told my son that since the day he was born, and I really appreciate that. That meant a lot.
I hope I did it in a very respectful way.
Oh, you did, 100%, but that's how we raise our kids. We're in Oklahoma, too. You look him in the eye, and if he's not looking in the eye, I'd probably thumped him in the head. It's just, that's called respect. So I appreciate that. That meant a lot to me. I want to talk to you, obviously, about Yucca Mountain and your DOE's requirements. Can you summarize DOE's legal requirements pertaining to Yucca Mountain's licensing application?
Yes, sir. This body, as authorizers and the appropriations process, has, and I think the president's budget, $110 million for the licensing to go forward, and I look at that as a way to get, following the law. The law says that we will do this. There's an additional $10 million in that appropriation request for temporary storage as well.
Is DOE required to create the Office of Civil Radioactive Waste Management to manage all these activities?
Yes, by law.
In your last organizational chart for DOE, was this office included in it?
I can't answer that. You may know the answer to that.
I do, obviously. Yes, the answer to that is no.
Okay.
And as you alluded to a while ago, you are required by law to have that.
Yes, sir.
Can you explain maybe why it was left out?
Well, here would be my stab at that, is that just because it's not named and doesn't have a line item does not mean that its duties are not covered in the agency.
Do you know who's covering that then? And I say that because we really aren't seeing any.
Can I get back with you and answer these questions after I've had some time to dig down into it and get you the proper answers?
Yes, absolutely. Because what I'm trying to fish for here is if it's from the appropriation process, is if that's why the office isn't manned, if that's why the duties of that office isn't being done, then for the committee's purpose, we need to know. And we need to know what's keeping it from happening. And like I said, if it's from the appropriation perspective, we also need to know what it's going to take to do that. I think Mr. Shimkus alluded to how much it was costing the taxpayers right now just from the lawsuits that are taking place, from the storage that we're supposed to be taking care of as the United States government. And so I want to be able to help you. I want to work with you on it. So if you could, please get back to my office.
Yes,
let us know how we can help you, because that was really the line of the questions what I was going to. And I will actually yield back the remainder of my time.
Thank you to my friend from Oklahoma. Mr. Wahlberg, 5 minutes for questions, sir.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Secretary, for always being open to be here and answer the questions. Thank you for the energy you put into being the Secretary of Energy as well. It's encouraging for those of us in the northern climes to know that that is actually happening. I have the privilege of representing the energy district of the state of Michigan. Over 30% of all energy produced in Michigan is produced in my district. It's a fleet of all of the above, and some of that fleet sits right on one of the Great Lakes, Lake Erie. And so we are definitely concerned with cybersecurity. The challenge is not only that we are able to turn the lights on at any time, but the environmental issues that go on, thinking of the proximity there in the Great Lakes. You recently formed the new Cybersecurity, Energy Security, and Emergency Response Office. I think that certainly shows, I believe, that you believe that elevating cybersecurity functions to a Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary level will help intergovernmental and interagency communications and multi-directional information sharing with the Department of Energy's ability to appropriately and quickly address cyber-related emergencies, and I thank you for that. My concern is the sustainability of the Department of Energy's leadership on this important issue. Cybersecurity was not a surpassing concern back in 1977 when the department was organized. It certainly is today. In my bill, with my colleague and ranking member Rush, H.R. 5174, we specify functions related to cybersecurity and emergency response that we believe should be specifically led by a Senate-confirmed Assistant Secretary. Will you work with us to ensure that we can elevate that Secretary to law?
Yes, sir.
Appreciate that. Over the past 7 months, you've had a lot of experience in dealing with emergency action in your department. During appearances before the committee in January, your Deputy Secretary and Undersecretary for Energy said that expectations for DOE's emergency response exceeded its authorities, if I recollect correctly. From your experience to date, do you think there may be some additional tools or authorities DOE could use to help improve the ability of the agency's deployment of resources in an emergency?
Yes, sir. I think it's always a thoughtful conversation to have to discuss with Congress and other agencies to make sure, we complement when we need to complement, but if there's a direct line of authority, that it's very clear, very precise, so that no one gets confused about, particularly during an emergency situation, who's in charge.
appreciate that, and we would definitely want to work together with you on that. We want to examine things like surge funding or some other mechanism to enable DOE to have access to resources so that the department can respond more rapidly. And so we hope that you can work with us on
Sir,
that.
thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
I would yield back to the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Duncan, for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Mr. Secretary, thank you for being here. I just want to lend my support at the outset here for the Nuclear Waste Policy Amendments Act that Chairman Shimkus and Mark Wayne Mullen from Oklahoma have mentioned. Getting Yucca Mountain back on track is imperative because we've got a lot of waste sitting around this country, and some of that is sitting at a place you visited back in February, and I want to thank you for visiting Savannah River site and Savannah River National Laboratory this year. SRS is an integral part in the Department of Energy's industrial complex responsible for environmental stewardship and cleanup, waste management, and disposition of nuclear materials, along with a lot of other missions, ongoing missions that Savannah River site has. And thank you for recognizing the important role of SRS through the DOE's fiscal 2019 budget. I believe it provided for about $1.7 billion, $287 million above enacted 2017 levels. I'm on the cleanup caucus, and we're concerned about environmental management and cleaning up the tank farms at sites like Savannah River site, Hanford, and others. And the South Carolina Department of Health and Environmental Control describes the liquid waste management as SRS as the single greatest environmental risk in South Carolina. There are more than 30 years of nuclear weapons material that's been produced in South Carolina sitting in those tank farms, and the ongoing environmental management efforts are there. We also have the ability through the Defense Waste Processing Facility at SRS to vitrify that high-level nuclear waste, turn it to glass so that it no longer poses a threat to leakage through those tanks and into the ground and aquifers. So the DOE's fiscal year 2019 budget requests an additional $74 million for SRS cleanup programs from the 2016 levels, emphasis on the liquid tank waste cleanup project. What are DOE's top cleanup priorities for the site, and how is your particular attention as Secretary going to facilitate tangible cleanup progress in South Carolina?
Obviously, we have a court-mandated requirement that we're very sensitive to, and making sure that we have the resources to be able to do that. You know, we've had the discussion substantially over the last year since I've been at the DOE over the issue of how to deal with the plutonium and to clean that up. While I was out there, I saw some good progress that's being made from the standpoint of the vitrification process that's going on there, and the tanks that are going to be used to store that, being able to move the plutonium out of South Carolina, and we're already doing that with the D&D process, but to get that substantially more robust, to be able to move that waste out of there on an expedited schedule is obviously high on our priority list, if not the highest priority there.
Well, I appreciate that, Mr. Secretary, and you know, whether it's at Hanford with their waste facility trying to vitrify the waste that's coming out of their tank farms, ultimately, this high-level radioactive waste needs to go to Yucca Mountain, and right now, the vitrified waste is sitting on concrete slab under a metal building at the Savannah Riverside. It's actually down in the concrete, as you saw.
Yes, sir.
Let me shift gears, but stay at Savannah Riverside because we have the MOX facility down there. We're under obligation under the Non-Proliferation Treaty with countries like Russia to do something with the nation's plutonium that's coming out of the non-proliferation aspects. And I believe the MOX facility at SRS is the right thing to do with the plutonium. Currently, we're committed to rid the world of about, I think, enough plutonium to make 17,000 nuclear weapons. So I would love to see the continuation of construction at the MOX program and eventually completion. We've already spent a ton of money down there, and I truly believe we can bring more efficiency to the project, and it can be completed in a third of time and for almost half the additional cost than what the NNSA predicts. You indicated in your testimony that the 2019 budget continues termination activities for the MOX, but provides $220 million for use toward orderly, safe closure for the project. What do you envision for the future of this site, the MOX facility? And if not MOX, what do you determine to be the most efficient and effective way to remove the plutonium from South Carolina? We didn't ask for the plutonium to come there. It's stored on site. It's not a long-term storage facility. It was brought there in order to be turned into mixed oxide fuel to be used in nuclear reactors around the country. That is what the purpose was.
Yes,
We
sir.
spent a lot of money. Where are we going from here?
Yes, sir. And I'll try to be as brief as I can. The issue on the reason that got started was an agreement with the Russians. The Russians have unilaterally walked away from that agreement. They said they would come back to the table if we met certain requirements, and you know what those are, and you know, Mr. Duncan, they're unacceptable. I mean, they're asking us to do things that this country's not going to do to come back and sit down with the table. So the way I look at that is they've walked away, and we have to look at our options. This is a facility that is obscenely over budget. And again, I don't want to rehash and relitigate all these numbers, but the fact is there is an alternative. And the alternative is dilute and dispose, which we are using now, and as a matter of fact, shipping plutonium out of South Carolina to WHIP at this particular point in time. We think
The
that
EPA has said that WHIP's not an acceptable site. Yucca might be. The thing is, Russia has walked away, but the facts of the matter are we have plutonium sitting in South Carolina that's come out of that non-proliferation agreement. WHIP's not going to be ready. Yucca, we're struggling around here to fund that. MOX is absolutely the right facility, and I'd love to sit down with you and talk with you about that at some point. Mr. Chairman, thanks for leaning. I yield back.
You're on.
Time's expired. Mr. Long, 5 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Secretary Perry, for being here today.
Yes, sir.
Texas A&M University, where's that located?
Where's it located?
Yes.
College Station, Texas.
It's, some would
I
say
don't believe
that,
I yielded to you, did I?
some would say it's at the, of the epicenter of the world, but we'll just leave it at, it's in Brazos County, Texas.
College Station, Texas?
In the city of College Station.
And that's the only campus?
No, sir. It's the main campus. There are.
I didn't ask you about the main campus. I said, where's it located?
Oh, it's in College Station, Texas, on Highway 6, and it goes both ways.
That's the only campus?
It's the only main campus.
Where are the other campuses?
The other campuses are
Outside of this country. I'll cut to the chase.
They're in a lot of different places.
Like Qatar?
Dalton, and there is one in the country of Qatar, right?
I was in Qatar
Doha.
10 days ago.
Yes, sir.
And walked in, and they are all Aggie there, trust me. They are very, very happy with their affiliation, and the students are doing great. Your picture was right there on the wall as I walked in.
Yes, sir.
And they're Aggie through and through. So I was pleased to see your picture on the wall. We went in and toured Texas A&M and Qatar just the other day. Speaking of universities, I'd like to speak about another university. In recent hearings with your senior Department of Energy leadership, I asked about the Department of Energy's support of the University of Missouri's MURR nuclear reactor. The MURR reactor trains nuclear engineers, some of whom are funded through Department of Energy's Nuclear Energy University program. Private companies, in coordination with the university, are seeking approval to produce life-saving medical isotopes in partnership with the National Nuclear Security Administration, NNSA. And the university is currently studying a partnership with the NNSA to convert the reactor to use low-enriched uranium instead of highly enriched uranium, or HEU. I got to tell you, I was disappointed to see that the integrated university programs were defunded in your fiscal year 2019 budget, but I hope you see the value in these activities as we do at the University of Missouri. Will you please talk about the importance of our nuclear research infrastructure and how the Department of Energy supports this critical work, particularly in its university programs.
Yes, sir. I think you're making reference to the research reactor there at the University of Missouri, and it's in medical isotopes and the manufacture of medical isotopes. And that's, there are a number of places across the country that we're partnering with that. And it is for precision medicine, for some of the things that we talked about with Mr. McNerney on our ability to practice precision medicine. These facilities are really going to be important. So
So very important, So
want to work with you. And
all righty, thank you. With the ever-increasing cyber threats to the grid, I am pleased that the steps have been taken to create CSER, the Office of Cyber, Energy, Security, and Emergency Response, and I look forward to that office getting up and running. In your opinion, since your confirmation, has the electric grid become more or less responsive to cybersecurity threats?
well, I think the threat has increased, but that shouldn't shock anyone. I think the threat potential is greater today than it was a year ago. Are we more resilient? I can't answer that with great definition. What I think is that we are exposed in certain areas. We need to be all hands on deck. That's the reason that we're asking for the cyber office to be stood up. With that said, our national labs are making some, I think, good inroads in both the defensive and offensive ways to deal with those that would attack our electrical grid.
Let me ask you one more question. I'll be about out of time at the end of this probably, but the fiscal year 2019 budget calls for $96 million in funding for the CSER, or for CSER. Can you explain a little bit about the program and how this money will be used to ensure we are securing our grid from the continuous cyber threats that we face?
Well, the focus is on the cyber threats from both state actors, and we're talking about a year ago, Russia with Petya we saw the impact on that. We've seen what's happened in Ukraine with 2 attacks on our power grid. The Iranians who attacked the Aramco electrical, or their control panels. So nation-state attacks are very real. They're not going to, as late as this last week, we had conversations about, what can we expect with the Syrian issue. Should we be on more heightened alert? And I would suggest to you, yes. So the issue is this Office of Cybersecurity, our national labs, working with the private sector, working with universities. I don't think it's ever been more important for us to be able to maintain the national security of this country relative to our grid. Both, as we've talked about at length here today, about the resources to be able to keep the power to that grid, but also to protect that grid from cyber attacks is as important as it's ever been in our country's history.
Thank you, and thanks for being here today. It's been a long hearing. I'm sure you're kind of tired, and I yield back.
Time to expire. The gentleman from Massachusetts have 5 minutes for questions. Mr. Kennedy.
One more to go, Mr. Secretary. Thank you. Thank you for your patience. Thank you for spending so much time with us. And I'll echo the comments of our colleagues. Thank you for being so accessible. Grateful that you're here. As our nation makes a transition from a 20th to 21st century energy economy, we know that innovative sources of power will be an important part of that generation mix. Wind power is a steadily growing portion of the energy sector that provides clean power to millions of Americans and creates thousands of jobs across our country. Your home state of Texas, Mr. Secretary, during your tenure as governor, wind power resources and energy grew by leaps and bounds. It's my understanding that according to ERCOT, wind made up 17% of the fuel mix in 2017. So I wanted to ask you, I think, a pretty general question to start. Do you agree, Mr. Secretary, that wind energy is an important part of our nation's power sector?
Yes, sir.
So despite this growth, I appreciate the answer, we have only one offshore wind project coming online in the United States. Other nations such as the UK, Germany, and China have developed these projects in their own waters. My home state of Massachusetts proposes to be a leader in this effort. In my district, we've made significant investments in Fall River and in Dartmouth and just across the border of the district and in New Bedford to become a national leader in offshore wind. Just recently, the Department of the Interior announced proposed sales of 2 areas off the coast of Massachusetts to develop offshore wind. Yet unfortunately, Mr. Secretary, America risks being left behind as our allies and peers lead the growth of an industry that remains largely dormant here, despite the potential to boost the economy and create jobs. Even more concerning, I know you've already touched about this a bit, is this year's budget request from the Trump administration that included a 72% cut in the DOE Office of Energy Efficiency and Renewable Energy. I'm not going to make you comment on that again. I think you've been pretty clear about where you stand on that cut. But I do want to ask you how DOE is going to continue to support research and development of offshore wind.
And Mr. Kennedy, we discussed this is an industry that's becoming mature, and so the private sector, the states, if in my home state, one of the reasons we had that big wind energy growth was that the state invested in the CREZ lines. We didn't subsidize the specific projects, but we basically said, we're going to build these lines if you all will commit to building all this, these farms out. They did, and you know what the results are. So I think not only the state, but the private sector has the place to play this. Here's what I will tell you that the DOE is going to continue to play a role in this. This is important. And again, we were in Livermore this last week, and the technology that's coming out of there, and this is on, again, rotor technology that makes these turbines substantially more efficient so that, and then that gets commercialized and goes into the private sector where it makes it even more of a commercialized product and the market more competitive. So my point is we're going to continue to be a partner, maybe not as big as we were when wind and solar was more of its infancy. We're shifting over to batteries and beyond battery to hydrogen fuels and some of the more immature but may have great potential energy sources in the future. So, I'm a big believer in wind, and I hope that Massachusetts and other states that want to see a diverse portfolio. I don't think it's a good idea to have Russian molecules of gas in Boston Harbor. But if you can't get it from the West, you're going to get it from somewhere. And I think that's another debate or discussion that we can have into the future about how we make sure that this entire country is got an infrastructure that will allow for all of our citizens to enjoy this energy revolution that's occurring in America.
And Mr. Secretary, I appreciate that. I would agree with you. It obviously gets complex as you try to look at the local resources and the voices of the local community. We do have a vibrant local community that is, I think, ready and willing to make this investment in coordination with our federal government partners, DOI, DOE, and I'd ask just for you to keep it on your radar and as we to be a partner. And as we've seen and as we saw under your stewardship in Texas, to see the growth of wind industry there. Just to finish this, to make sure that the point is clear, I think it is. In 2017, the Clean Energy States Alliance, a coalition of state energy agencies, released 3 reports on the future of offshore wind in the Northeast. The reports, which are actually partially funded by DOE, that project that offshore wind projects in the Northeast have the potential to add more than 35,000 jobs in the region. My colleagues Nikki Songus and Bill Keating just introduced a bill that would create a grant program to support offshore wind job training, including partnerships with colleges and universities, nonprofits, unions, and local governments. Investment in that wind energy is more than just a clean energy future, especially in my district, sir. It represents jobs, economic development, opportunity, education, and a whole new industry base and expertise that is homegrown. I know the DOE mission is to, quote, ensure America's energy security and prosperity by addressing its energy, environmental, and nuclear challenges through transformative science and technological solutions. So I would hope that you would continue to focus on how we can partner with you, understanding there's got to be a private sector component to this and a state component to this, but yes, I think we've seen that there is a willingness to do so. We're going to need your help.
And Mr. Kennedy, one of the things that I will offer you, and to make the the introduction, the university in Texas that probably has as good a wind energy history and experience and expertise is Texas Tech in Lubbock, Texas. And getting the states to work with each other, that may be a great opportunity. There used to be a real good Boston to Austin connectivity, so Boston to Lubbock might be okay too.
I appreciate that, sir. As long as we're not talking football, we're in good
Yes,
shape.
sir.
Thank you, sir.
Time has expired. Seeing no further members wishing to ask questions, I'd like to thank Secretary Perry for coming this afternoon. And I trust, sir, that the procedure you talked with Anita before did not happen here today. You know what I'm talking about, correct?
That's correct.
And you're cleared now to depart the pattern with a proud, loud Aggie whoop.
We're done.
And before we conclude, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit the following documents for the record. Letters from the Utilities Technology Council, a statement from the R Street Institute, 3 letters to the President from members of Congress, a letter to the President from the International Brotherhood of Teamsters, a letter to the President from the United Mine Workers of America, a letter to the President from the International Brotherhood of Boilmakers, Iron Shipbuilders, Blacksmiths, and Forgers and Helpers, a letter to the President from Utility Workers Union of America, letter to Secretary Perry from the Energy Industry Trade Association, letter to Secretary Perry from the Pennsylvania Public Utility Commission, letter to Secretary Perry from the First Energy, response letter from PJM to Secretary Perry, letter from NEI to Chairman Walden. Without objection, so ordered. Pursuant to committee rules, I remind members that they have 10 business days to submit additional questions for the record. I ask that the witnesses submit their response within 10 business days upon receipt of the questions. Without objection, this subcommittee is adjourned.